A man who saved 3 lives stands alone in a crowded room, and not one person will look him in the eye. That is Iron Ridge. That is Silas Mercer. Scarred, silent, and sentenced by a town that never asked what really happened the night that fire changed everything. But one woman, a stranger who'd lost nearly everything herself, read a single honest letter and decided that a man who tells the truth about his ugliness is worth more than 100 men who lie about their beauty. What she did next shook an entire frontier to its foundation. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The first frost of October came early that year. It arrived sometime before dawn, quiet and indifferent, settling over Iron Ridge the way trouble always settled over that town. Without announcement, without apology, and without any particular concern for the people it inconvenienced. By the time the sun cracked the eastern ridgeline and sent long amber lights sliding down Main Street, every rooftop wore a thin crust of white, and the mud that had plagued the thoroughfare since September had finally hardened into something a person could walk across without losing a boot. Silas Mercer noticed the frost before he noticed anything else. He noticed it because he was already awake, already working, already doing the thing he'd done every morning for the past 11 years, feeding coal into the belly of his forge before the rest of the town had opened its eyes. The bellows wheezed. The coals brightened from black to orange to a mean, pulsing red. The first wave of heat pushed against his face, and he turned instinctively, the way he always did, presenting his left side to the fire instead of his right. Old habit, the kind that forms when you spend enough years learning which parts of yourself you lead with. The forge sat at the north end of Iron Ridge's main street, a low-roofed building of rough-hewn timber and riverstone that looked, on its best day, like it had been assembled by men who were in a hurry and arguing while they worked. Which was more or less exactly what had happened. The town itself had been carved out of the Colorado high country by miners, cattlemen, and a particular breed of stubborn optimist who believed that any place with water and flat ground was good enough to call home. Iron Ridge had water. It had flat ground. It had, against considerable odds, survived long enough to become a proper settlement with a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a church, and a post office that doubled as the telegraph office on the 3 days a week when the telegraph actually functioned. What it also had, and what its residents preferred not to dwell on too openly, was Silas Mercer. He was 38 years old and built the way men get built when they've spent 2 decades swinging hammers and hauling iron, thick through the shoulders, heavy in the hands, with forearms that looked carved from the same dense timber as the forge walls. He stood just over 6 feet tall and moved with the particular economy of motion that comes not from grace, but from years of working in tight spaces around very hot things. He didn't waste movement. He didn't waste words either. The left side of his face was, by any ordinary measure, an unremarkable face. Strong jaw, straight nose, dark eyes set deep under a heavy brow. The kind of face that didn't demand attention, but would hold it if you gave it. A face that had probably been handsome once, or something near enough to handsome that the distinction wouldn't have mattered much. The right side of his face was something else entirely. The burn scars started at the corner of his jaw and climbed, pulling the skin tight over his cheekbone, swallowing the outer edge of his ear, reaching in jagged, uneven tributaries toward his temple and the ridge of his brow. The skin there was pale in some places, dark and slightly raised in others, textured in the way that scar tissue always is, not smooth, not raw, just permanently, irrevocably different from the skin around it. His right eye had survived without damage, which was either fortunate or cruel depending on your perspective, because it meant he could see perfectly well the exact expression that crossed people's faces the first time they got a clear look at him. He'd watched that expression for 11 years. He had stopped expecting anything different. By 7 in the morning, he had already finished 3 pieces. A set of door hinges for the general store, a wagon wheel rim that had cracked on the trail from Pueblo, and a custom branding iron for the Caldwell Ranch. He worked with a kind of ferocious focus that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with necessity, because when his hands were moving and the metal was singing under the hammer, there was very little room in his head for anything else. That was, as far as Silas was concerned, the primary virtue of hard work. He heard the stagecoach come through at 8:15. He heard it every morning, the rattle of the wheels on the hardened mud, the driver's shout, the particular exhausted sound of horses that had been pulling since before sunrise. He didn't look up. He was in the middle of drawing out a length of bar stock into a taper, and the work didn't care about stagecoaches. What he did notice, maybe 20 minutes later, was the quiet. Iron Ridge was never truly quiet during business hours. There was always some noise filtering through the open front of his forge. The livery stable hands arguing, wagon traffic, someone's dog making its opinion known about something. But for a stretch of maybe 3 or 4 minutes, the street outside went oddly still. Then voices, lower and more purposeful than usual. Then footsteps on the boardwalk, and the particular shuffling sound that meant a cluster of people had arranged themselves to observe something they found interesting. Silas set down his hammer. He walked to the front of the forge and stood in the wide doorway, wiping his hands on the leather apron he wore over his work clothes. He couldn't see the stagecoach from his angle, but he could see a portion of the street, and he could see the people. Maybe 15 of them, gathered in loose, casual-looking arrangements that fooled nobody. The kind of gathering that pretended to be accidental, but had clearly organized itself with some specific spectacle in mind. Martha Bellows, the general store owner's wife, stood near the front, arms folded, with the expression she wore when she was waiting to be proven right about something. Beside her, 2 of the Caldwell ranch hands had stopped whatever they were doing and turned to face down the street. Even Reverend Phelps had found a reason to stand on the church steps, though he was careful to arrange himself in a posture that could, from a distance, be mistaken for merely taking the morning air. Silas looked at all of them. Then he stepped back into his forge, picked up his hammer, and went back to work. Whatever they were gathering for, it had nothing to do with him. Except, of course, it had everything to do with him. 6 weeks earlier, in a moment of what he would later privately describe as either honesty or temporary insanity, and he wasn't always sure there was much difference between those two things, Silas Mercer had written a marriage advertisement and sent it east. He hadn't done it because he had any real expectation of success. He'd done it because he was tired. Not physically tired. That kind of tiredness he understood and could manage, could pour into the forge and burn off through 12-hour days until it turned into something productive. What he was tired of was harder to name. It was the tiredness of eating every meal alone, of returning to a house where the only sound was the wind finding its way through the gaps in the siding, of having the same conversations with himself over and over again. The kind of internal conversations where you start asking questions you already know the answers to, and the answers are all the same, and the same answer, repeated often enough, starts to feel less like a fact and more like a sentence. He was tired of his own silence, so he'd written the advertisement, and he'd written it the way he did most things, without ornamentation, without pretense, without any particular attempt to make himself sound better than he was. Blacksmith, 38 years, Iron Ridge, Colorado Territory. Honest work, honest wages, honest life. I own my forge and my land outright. I am not a cruel man, not a drinking man, and not a man given to idleness. I should tell you plainly that I carry significant burn scars on the right side of my face and neck, not from carelessness, but from circumstances I am willing to explain in person. I will not deceive anyone into coming west and finding something other than what was promised. If you are a woman of practical mind and steady character who is tired of hardship and is willing to try something different, I would be glad to hear from you. I do not expect beauty. I only ask for honesty in return. He had read it back to himself twice before sealing the envelope. Both times he thought about adding something more, something warmer, something that would make him sound less like a man filling out a legal document and more like a person who had actual feelings worth sharing. Both times he decided against it. He'd told the truth. He'd asked for the truth back. That was more than most advertisements offered, and he figured it was enough. He sent it to 3 different papers, one in Kansas City, one in St. Louis, and one in Chicago, and settled in to wait. He received 22 responses over the following 4 weeks. 19 of them he set aside almost immediately, not out of cruelty, but because they made it clear in various ways that the women writing them hadn't actually read past the first line of his advertisement. They spoke of romantic scenery and adventure and the exciting life of the frontier without once acknowledging the part where he had told them, plainly, in writing, that he had a scarred face and that anyone coming west should expect to find that and nothing else. He didn't blame them for it. People read what they want to read, but he wasn't willing to invite a woman across the country on the basis of something she'd misunderstood. Two more he spent considerable time over, reading and rereading, trying to determine whether the women were genuinely interested or simply desperate. He eventually concluded that desperation wasn't necessarily the wrong motivation. He was fairly sure he understood something about that himself, but both letters had a quality to them that he couldn't quite name, a kind of careful vagueness, as if the writer was trying to present as small a target as possible to give him nothing he might reject. That made him uneasy in a way he couldn't fully explain. He wanted someone who would tell him things he might not want to hear, not someone skilled at telling him only what he might want. The 22nd letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon. He almost didn't open it that day. He had a full slate of work, and the mail usually waited until evening. But something about the handwriting on the envelope caught him. It was neat, but not delicate. The letters formed with a kind of deliberate precision that suggested someone who had learned to write carefully because careless writing led to being misunderstood. And being misunderstood had cost her something. He opened it at his workbench, sitting on an upturned crate, still wearing his apron. "Mr. Mercer, I will not write to you prettily, because I suspect that's not what you're asking for. You were honest, so I'll be honest back. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 34 years old, a widow going on 3 years. My husband Thomas was a good man who died of fever before we had a chance to build much of anything together. I have no children, no family left worth mentioning, and no particular prospects where I currently am, which is a boarding house in St. Louis that I pay for by taking in mending. I am not miserable, but I'm also not under any illusion that things are going to improve significantly if I stay where I am. I read your advertisement 3 times. I want you to know that I read the part about your scars. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter, because I don't know yet whether it matters or not. I've never seen your face. What I can tell you is that it isn't the part I kept thinking about. The part I kept thinking about was where you said you wouldn't deceive anyone into coming west and finding something other than what was promised. I have been deceived before, Mr. Mercer, about smaller things by people who should have known better, and I find I have very little patience left for it. I am practical. I am not delicate. I know how to work hard, and I am not afraid of weather or inconvenience or discomfort. I will tell you the truth about myself even when the truth is not flattering, and I will expect the same from you. If that sounds like something worth exploring, I am willing to correspond further. Sincerely, Evelyn Harper." Silas read it twice. Then he set it down on the workbench and sat with it for a while, not reading, just sitting. Then he wrote back, The correspondence lasted 5 weeks, not long by some measures. But the letters they exchanged in those 5 weeks were not the letters of strangers performing interest for each other. They were, from the very beginning, the letters of 2 people who had both decided, for reasons that didn't entirely need explaining, that they were done with the performance version of themselves. She told him about Thomas, not sentimental stories but practical ones, the day-to-day texture of a marriage that had been honest and affectionate, and cut short before it had a chance to become something more complicated. She told him about the boarding house, about the women she shared walls with, about the particular gray quality of days that were adequate but not good. She told him she had a bad knee that ached in cold weather, and that she was a mediocre cook but an excellent seamstress, and that she had strong opinions about people who didn't say what they meant. He told her about the forge, about Iron Ridge, not the flattering version, not the frontier romance version, but the actual version, the dust and the isolation and the hard winters and the fact that the nearest proper doctor was half a day's ride in good weather. He told her about his house, which was functional but sparse. He told her that he was not a man who talked much in company, but that he generally had more to say than he let on, and that he had found the limitation of his own silences to be a significant problem. He did not, in any of the 5 weeks of letters, directly address the fire. He mentioned it once, told her it was a matter he would explain in person, that he felt it deserved a face-to-face conversation rather than a letter. She wrote back and said she respected that, and she didn't push. What she did push on, gently, was whether he actually wanted this. Not in a confrontational way. She just asked the question plainly, partway through their 3rd week of correspondence, in a paragraph that he read several times because of how directly it was aimed. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Do you want a wife, Silas, or do you want company? Because those are different things, and both of them are legitimate, but they require different expectations. I'm not asking to be difficult. I'm asking because I've spent 3 years being something to people. A tenant, a seamstress, a widow, a neighbor. when what I actually want is to be someone to one specific person. If that's what you're looking for too, then I think we should keep writing. If it's not, I'd rather we say so now." He had sat with that paragraph for a long time, long enough that the forge went cold around him, and the October evening came in through the open front of the building and settled around him without him noticing. Then he wrote back, "I want a wife. I want what you described. I don't entirely know how to be someone to another person. I have been alone a long time, and I am not under any illusion that the habit of solitude breaks easily. But I want to try. If that is an honest enough answer, I hope you'll keep writing." She kept writing. At the end of the 5th week, she sent a letter saying she had purchased a stagecoach ticket and would arrive in Iron Ridge on the 14th of October, assuming nothing went badly wrong along the way. He had stood at his workbench reading that sentence for a very long time. The problem, or one of the problems, because in Silas Mercer's experience problems rarely came alone, was that Iron Ridge was a small town, and small towns, whatever else they might be, were not places where news traveled slowly or where people minded their own business in any consistent or meaningful way. He had not told anyone about the advertisement. He had not told anyone about the letters. He had not, if he was being honest with himself, thought very carefully about what would happen when a woman stepped off the stagecoach and walked toward him in front of the entire town. What he'd been thinking about, what had occupied most of the real estate in his mind for those 5 weeks, was her. Not the town's reaction, just her. Whether she would be different from the letters, whether he would be different from his letters, whether two people who had been honest on paper could manage to be honest in the same room without the buffer of distance making it easier. He had not thought about what the town would do with it. The town had figured it out anyway. That was the thing about Iron Ridge. It didn't need to be told things. It sensed them. Martha Bellows had seen him at the post office 4 times in 2 weeks, which was 3 times more than his usual frequency. And Martha Bellows was not a woman who let patterns go unexamined. She had mentioned it to her husband Earl, who had mentioned it to the Caldwell ranch hands when they came in for supplies, who had mentioned it to anyone who would listen, and by the time the stagecoach arrived on the morning of the 14th, a good portion of the town's adult population had arranged themselves along Main Street under the pretense of various ordinary business. Silas was not among them. He was in his forge, working, because it was the only thing he knew how to do with the particular grinding, low-grade anxiety that had been sitting in his chest since before dawn. He heard the stagecoach stop. He heard the driver call out. He set down his hammer. He was not a man who prayed. Not anymore, not for a long time. And he wasn't going to start on a Tuesday morning in October in front of a coal forge. But there was something he did, something that was less than prayer and more than thought, a kind of internal settling, a deliberate steadying of himself the way you steady a piece of iron before the hammer falls. Whatever happens next, you told the truth. That's all you had to offer. If it's not enough, it's not enough. He untied his apron and hung it on the hook beside the bellows. He rolled down his sleeves, which was not something he normally bothered with during working hours. He ran a hand through his hair, which accomplished nothing useful. Then he walked out of the forge and into the October morning. Yes. The stagecoach had stopped 30 yards down the street, in front of the post office. The driver was already on the ground, pulling luggage from the boot. There were 3 passengers. A heavy-set man in a merchant's coat who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. A young man with a surveyor's case who stepped down and immediately began looking at the sky with professional interest, and a woman. Silas saw her before she saw him. She stepped down from the coach without waiting for help, one hand bracing briefly against the doorframe and then releasing it, as if she'd considered accepting assistance and decided she didn't need it. She was not a small woman, not in any of the ways that word usually implied. She was medium height, solid, with the posture of someone who had spent a long time carrying weight, not dramatically, but just quietly and continuously. She wore a dark green traveling dress that had clearly been well made once and was still decent but had seen serious miles. She had brown hair pinned up severely, with a few strands that had escaped the pinning and were doing their own thing around her face. Her face was not a soft face. It was the face of someone who had learned to keep her expressions from running ahead of her thoughts, someone who listened before reacting. She had a trunk and a smaller bag. She instructed the driver, in a tone that was polite but left no room for argument, about where she wanted them set. Then she turned and looked at the street. Silas had stopped walking. He was standing in the middle of Main Street, maybe 20 yards from her, and the gathered residents of Iron Ridge were arranged on either side of him like a particularly judgmental audience at a theater production nobody had actually agreed to attend. He watched her take in the street. He watched her eyes move from the buildings to the people, too. And there was a perceptible pause, a moment where the scanning stopped. Him. He had thought about this moment. He'd thought about it many times, in many versions. He'd imagined her looking at his face and going very still. He'd imagined a series of small, careful adjustments in her expression as she processed the reality of the thing against the idea she'd been carrying. He'd imagined, in his worst versions of it, the specific quality of a person realizing they'd made a mistake. What he had not particularly imagined was what actually happened. She looked at him for maybe 3 full seconds, and then she picked up her smaller bag, left the trunk for the driver to manage, and started walking directly toward him. Not cautiously, not hesitantly. She walked the way she'd stepped off the coach, with the posture of someone who had made a decision and was seeing it through. The residents of Iron Ridge, almost as a single organism, went completely silent. Silas made himself stand still. Every instinct he'd honed over 11 years told him to turn to his better side, to angle himself, to manage what she was seeing. He didn't. He stood square to her and let her look at whatever she was going to look at. She stopped 3 feet in front of him. She was close enough that he could see her eyes clearly. Gray, or close to gray, the kind of color that changes with the light. She looked at his face, both sides of it. She didn't try to avoid the scarred side, and she didn't stare at it either. She just looked at him the way you look at a person you're trying to know. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steadier than he'd expected, lower than he'd expected. "I'm Evelyn Harper." "I know," he said. It came out rougher than he intended. I figured, from the coach. "You're taller than I expected." "You're—" He stopped, started again. "You look like your letters." She blinked once. Then, briefly, something that might have been a smile moved across her face. Not a performance of warmth, but the real thing. A little reluctant, a little surprised at itself. "I'm not sure what that means." "I'm not entirely sure either." He paused. "I'm glad you came." "Well," she said, "I told you I would." He reached out his hand. She looked at it, just for a moment, and then shook it. Her grip was firm and direct, the grip of someone who had decided handshakes were either worth doing properly or not worth doing at all. Behind them, from various points along the boardwalk, Silas could hear the audience of Iron Ridge exhaling in a collective, disappointed way. They had come expecting a scene. What they were getting was 2 people meeting in the middle of a street and shaking hands like reasonable adults. Martha Bellows, from her position near the general store, said something in a low voice to her neighbor. Silas couldn't hear the exact words, but he recognized the tone. He'd been hearing that tone for 11 years. Evelyn heard it too. She glanced toward the boardwalk. Not nervously, but the way you glance when you want to understand the layout of a room before you commit to moving through it. "Is it always like this?" she asked quietly. "The watching?" He considered. "Pretty much." "And does it bother you?" He thought about lying. It would have been a comfortable lie, and she might not have caught it. But she'd told him she wanted honesty, even when it wasn't flattering, and he figured that applied to himself as much as to her. "Yes," he said, "but I've gotten better at not showing it." She looked at him again, that same direct, considering look. "That's honest," she said. "I told you I would be." "You did?" She shifted the bag on her shoulder. "I'd like to see the house, if that's all right, and the forge, eventually, but the house first." "It's down the north end," he said, "past the forge." "Will they follow us?" He glanced at the assembled townspeople. Several of them, caught in the act of open observation, found sudden pressing business in other directions. "Probably not all of them," he said. "A few might." "Good enough," she said, and she started walking. He fell into step beside her. It was slightly awkward, the particular awkwardness of 2 people who had not yet worked out the physical grammar of being in proximity to each other, who didn't know yet whether to walk close or give space, who were both conscious of the watching and trying not to perform for it. After a moment, she said, "The forge, is that smoke coming from it now? I was working when the coach came in." "You went back and forth? Or did you leave the fire going?" Left it going. I banked it down, but it'll need tending. She nodded. Does it run itself mostly? Or does it need constant attention? He looked at her sideways. You want to talk about the forge? I want to understand how your day works, she said. If we're going to share a house, I need to know when you'll be in it and when you won't. That seems practical. It was practical. It was the most practical thing anyone had said to him in a long time, and something about it loosened a knot in his chest that he hadn't known was there. The forge needs attention all day if there's work, he said. Most days there's work. I'm usually in by dark, sometimes a little after. Do you eat a midday meal? When I remember to. You don't remember regularly? Not always. She made a small sound, not judgment exactly, more like someone filing information. I'll bring something over then, when I've had time to figure out the kitchen. He didn't say anything to that. He wasn't sure what to say. It was such a small, ordinary thing. Someone suggesting they might bring him food, and it hit him somewhere unexpected. They walked the rest of the way to the house without talking much. The house itself was exactly as he'd described it in his letters. Functional, sparse, in need of things he hadn't known how to want. She walked through it quietly, opening doors, looking at rooms, her face giving very little away. She asked a few questions. Where the well was, whether the stove drew properly, which direction the wind came from in winter. He answered each one. In the second bedroom, which had been, until this moment, used primarily for storing things that didn't have a better place to be. She set down her bag and stood in the middle of the room for a moment, just taking stock. I'll need some shelving, she said, and a proper mirror. Somewhere sensible. I can make shelving, he said. She turned and looked at him. I know. That's why I said it. There was a long pause. Silas leaned against the doorframe, and Evelyn stood in the middle of the spare room with her green traveling dress and her escaped hair and her bad knee that he couldn't see but knew was there, and they looked at each other in the particular way of two people who have just made a decision large enough to be terrifying and have decided to be terrified quietly. This is strange, she said finally. Yes, he agreed. But not bad strange, she said. It was almost a question. He thought about it honestly. No, he said. Not bad strange. She nodded, as if he'd confirmed something she'd been considering. Then she started taking things out of her bag, and Silas, after a moment, pushed off the doorframe and went back out into the October morning to tend his fire. They were married 3 days later. Reverend Phelps performed the ceremony in the church, which was the only place in Iron Ridge where such things officially happened, and the Reverend did his job with professional thoroughness and a minimum of personal commentary, which Silas appreciated. Evelyn had worn the dress she'd apparently been saving for the occasion. A deep blue wool, simpler than a formal dress, but clearly chosen with intention, with her hair pinned more carefully than it had been on the day of her arrival. She had brought flowers from somewhere, a small bunch of dried autumn wildflowers that she held during the ceremony, and afterward, for no reason he could identify, gave to the Reverend's wife. There were no guests, by their mutual agreement. A few people drifted past the church during the ceremony and peered through the windows, which Silas ignored with the practiced ease of someone who had been peered at his entire adult life. After the ceremony, they walked back to the house. The sun was low and orange, doing the thing it did in October in the high country, where the light gets a particular quality, slanted and amber, making everything look slightly more significant than it probably is. How do you feel? Evelyn asked. Silas considered the question. Like I've done something I can't take back, he said. She looked at him sharply. Is that good or bad? Good, he said. I'm not good at things I can take back. I tend to take them back. She walked a few more steps, thinking about that. That's an interesting thing to know about yourself. I've had 11 years mostly to myself, he said. You learn things. What else did you learn? He glanced at her. She was asking genuinely, not filling silence, not performing conversation, actually asking. That quiet is only comfortable up to a point, he said. After that, it starts to cost you something. She was quiet for a moment, the comfortable kind he was beginning to learn, not the vacuum kind. Yes, she said finally. I know that. The first week was more awkward than either of them had admitted it would be. Not badly awkward, not the kind that festers. Just the ordinary awkwardness of two adult people who have lived alone long enough to have deeply ingrained habits, suddenly occupying the same space and discovering that some of their habits were invisible to them until someone else walked into them. He liked silence in the mornings. She liked to think out loud. He was in the habit of leaving tools wherever he last used them. She was in the habit of everything having a specific place. A habit born, she told him, from years of living in a small room where disorder was the first thing that went wrong. "I'm not neat," he told her, when she'd reorganized the kitchen shelf twice in 4 days. "I know," she said, "but I'm not unreasonable. I'm just telling things where to live." The mallet was fine where it was. The mallet was on the table where food goes. He looked at the table. He looked at the shelf. He carried the mallet to the shelf. She cooked better than she'd claimed in her letters. Not elaborately, but solidly, the kind of cooking that is actually about feeding people rather than impressing them. She figured out the stove's particular temperament within 3 days and adapted to it. She brought midday meals to the forge 4 days out of 5, set them on the workbench without ceremony, and usually didn't stay long. She seemed to understand instinctively that his workspace was his space, and that arriving in it with too much presence would feel like an intrusion. But she stayed sometimes, and on the days she stayed, she asked questions about what he was making, and he found himself explaining things he'd never had occasion to explain to anyone, and discovered that he didn't mind explaining them. She listened the way she read, carefully, with follow-up questions that proved she'd actually been paying attention. "What's that going to be?" she asked one afternoon, watching him work a piece of iron into something not yet recognizable. "Hook," he said. "For the tack room at the Caldwell Ranch. They need 12. "How long for 12? 2 days, maybe. Depends on the coal." She watched him work for a while. "Do you enjoy it?" she asked. "Or is it just the thing you do?" He thought about that for longer than the question probably warranted. "Both," he said finally. "Some days it's just the thing I do. Other days—" He paused, watching the metal brighten under the hammer. "Other days, it's the one thing in the world that makes complete sense to me." She nodded slowly. "I understand that," she said. "Sewing is like that for me sometimes. Not always, but sometimes." It was not a dramatic conversation. It was not the kind of conversation you could point to afterward and say that was the moment. But it was the kind of conversation that over time builds something. The kind where two people discover they share not an experience, but a quality of experience, a particular relationship with work and effort, and the days when effort becomes something closer to meaning. The town watched all of this with a mixture of frustration and fascination. Iron Ridge had expected drama and was being denied it. They had expected Evelyn Harper to arrive, see Silas Mercer's face, and do something satisfying. Recoil, weep, demand to be sent back east, at minimum look visibly horrified. What she had done instead was shake his hand and ask about his work schedule, which was deeply unsatisfying from a theatrical standpoint. The watching continued, though. It just adapted. Women who had never had a reason to visit the north end of Main Street found reasons. Martha Bellows extended her regular morning walk to take her past the forge, where she could observe Evelyn hanging wash or sweeping the front step, or, on one memorable occasion, sitting on an upturned crate outside the forge entrance eating a meal alongside Silas, both of them not talking, which Martha described to 3 different people as unnatural. The men were less interested in the domestic details and more interested in what it meant for Silas specifically, whether the presence of a wife would change him in ways that affected his professional usefulness, which was the primary way the town thought about him. Their conclusion, after 2 weeks of observation, was that he was the same blacksmith he'd always been, which they filed under good, and had a wife in the house now, which they filed under strange. What nobody quite knew how to file was the question of what Evelyn thought of them. She was not, they discovered fairly quickly, the kind of woman who could be easily managed by a town's collective opinion. She was polite when politeness was warranted. She was not effusive. She noticed things. You could see her noticing, that slight attention in her expression when someone said something revealing, and she did not pretend not to notice. She was good at buying things from the general store and paying for them fairly and saying thank you in a way that was genuine without being warm. And she was equally good at not buying the friendship of people who had not yet decided to offer it honestly. The town, accustomed to running people along a predictable track, found this mildly aggravating. Martha Bellows made her move on a Wednesday in mid-October, 3 weeks after Evelyn's arrival. She timed it well, mid-morning, when Silas would definitely be in the forge and Evelyn would likely be home. She knocked on the front door with the expression of someone doing a charitable thing, and when Evelyn opened the door, Martha launched directly into the performance of a neighborly visit. Evelyn let her in, put water on for coffee that she was fairly sure Martha didn't actually want, and sat across from her at the kitchen table with the patient stillness of someone who has learned to wait for the real conversation to start. It started about 6 minutes in. "I hope you understand," Martha said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup, "that we don't bear Silas any particular ill will. It's just a small town develops habits about people, and habits are hard to break." "What kind of habits?" Evelyn asked. Martha shifted. "Well, people feel more comfortable when they know what to expect. From him, specifically. From the situation." A pause. "He's always been somewhat—" Another pause, longer. "He keeps to himself. He works," Evelyn said. "He's the best blacksmith within 50 miles, from everything I can tell. Your husband's hinges, the Caldwell Ranch's tack room fittings, the Harlan Graves property's gate ironwork, all of that came from Silas's forge." Martha looked slightly wrong-footed. "That's true. So when you say he keeps to himself," Evelyn said, not unkindly but without any softening, "I'm trying to understand what you mean exactly, because from where I'm sitting, he doesn't keep to himself. He works, and he delivers what he's paid for, and he stays out of other people's business. That seems like a reasonable way to be." "It's the—" Martha stopped, started, tried a different angle. "People are naturally a little cautious, is all. Given the— his face," Evelyn said. Martha flushed. "I didn't say." "I know you didn't." Evelyn looked at her directly. "But that's what you mean. And I'd rather we say it plainly, if you don't mind, because I've lived long enough to have very little patience for conversations that say one thing and mean another." She picked up her own coffee cup. "His face doesn't change what's behind it, Mrs. Bellows. As far as I can tell, what's behind it is an honest man who does good work and asks very little of anyone. If the town has a problem with that, the problem is the town's." Martha left 20 minutes later with the slightly dazed expression of someone who had come to deliver a lesson and had received one instead. Tasu. The forge was where things got complicated. Silas had known, in the abstract way you know things you'd rather not think about too directly, that sharing his life with someone would eventually mean sharing the parts of it he'd been keeping in the dark. Not secrets exactly, more like wounds you've learned not to put pressure on, that you've built careful habits around, that you only become aware of again when someone else bumps into them. It was the third week, on a Friday evening, when Evelyn bumped into one of them. She'd come by the forge near the end of the day to tell him supper would be ready in half an hour, and had found him in the middle of a job that required both hands and his full attention. A complex hinge mechanism for the Graves Ranch's new gate, the kind of work that didn't leave room for conversation. She'd sat on the upturned crate near the wall and waited, and he'd mostly forgotten she was there in the focused way he forgot everything when the work was demanding. He'd been turning the finished piece in his hands, examining it, when he'd noticed her watching his hands specifically. Not his face, not the work, his hands. And then he realized what she was seeing, which was what anyone who spent enough time near him eventually saw. The way he held tools on the right side slightly differently than the left. The way his right hand compensated for something without him entirely meaning to. "The fire that caused the scars," she said. Not as a question. He set the piece down on the workbench. Outside, the October wind picked up and ran along the roofline, making the building creak. "Yes," he said, "it affected your hand, too." "The right hand." "Some." He looked at it, turned it over, looked at the palm. The scarring was less visible there, mostly on the back of the hand and the forearm, but the effect on his grip was real. "I compensate." "I can see that." She was quiet for a moment. "Does it cause you pain?" "In cold weather, the hand stiffens. It's manageable." She nodded. Another pause, then, "You said you'd tell me about it in person." He had said that. It had been in the letters early on, a matter I'd rather explain face to face. He'd been carrying it like a debt for 3 weeks, and she'd been patient about it, not pushing, not asking, just waiting. He'd appreciated the waiting. He'd also known it couldn't go on indefinitely. He pulled his stool over to the bench and sat down. She was across from him, on the crate, in the orange light of the banked forge, and outside the sun was going down behind the mountains. He'd told this story twice in his life. Once to the doctor who'd treated him, once to a judge in a legal proceeding that no longer mattered. Both times he'd told it quickly, getting through it, not inhabiting it. He'd never told it to someone he expected to see the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. There was a family, he said, the Whitmore family. They had a homestead about 3 miles north of town. Martin Whitmore, his wife Clara, their 2 kids, boy about 8, girl about 5. He looked at his hands. This was 11 years ago, January, cold winter, maybe the coldest I remember. Evelyn was very still on her crate, just listening. Martin came to me in the morning, Silas continued. He'd had a chimney fire the week before, and the flue cap had buckled. He wanted me to make a new one. I told him I could have it ready in 3 days. He stopped, started again. That night, that same night, their chimney caught again, worse this time. The cap was already damaged, and there was a crack in the chimney wall that nobody had seen. The fire went up the wall, into the attic. It was 2 a.m. The forge ticked and settled around them. I was still awake, he said. I was working late, finishing a job. I smelled the smoke before I saw the fire. By the time I got up there, it was maybe 15 minutes, maybe less. The roof of the main house was going. He was quiet for a moment. Martin was outside. He'd gotten out, but he'd hurt his ankle in the fall. Couldn't go back in. Clara was still inside. She'd gone back for the kids. I went in. Evelyn made no sound. I got the girl out first, he said. She was in the back bedroom. The smoke hadn't reached there yet, not fully. Then I went back for the boy. The roof came down while I was in the hallway. He touched the right side of his face, not dramatically. Just the brief, unconscious gesture of someone acknowledging a fact. I got him out. I got Clara out. The house was gone. He looked up at her then, for the first time since he'd started talking. Nobody died, he said. That's the part people don't. When they look at my face, they see something that went wrong. And things did go wrong, but the things that mattered went right. He paused. I've had to remind myself of that more often than I'd like to admit. Evelyn sat on her crate in the forge light and looked at him. She didn't say anything immediately, and he didn't try to fill the silence, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms when someone is taking something seriously. The Whitmore family, she said finally. Are they still in the area? They left the following spring. Went south, I think. I got a letter from Martin 2 years after, thanking me. It was a good letter. He paused. I kept it. Of course you did, she said quietly. He looked at her. You're not going to say something about how I should be proud, or how it was a brave thing to do. No, she agreed. Good. He picked up the hinge mechanism again, turned it in his hands. I've heard that particular speech a few times. It doesn't land right. What happened happened, and I carry it the way I carry it. And some days that's fine, and some days it's less fine. I didn't tell you because I wanted a speech. I know, she said. You told me because you said you would. He looked at her. Because that's who you are, she said. Matter of fact. Not warm exactly, but certain. As if she'd reached a conclusion she was willing to stand behind. He set the hinge piece down again. Outside, the wind had eased. The forge had cooled to the point where the room temperature was starting to drop, and neither of them had moved to stoke it. Supper's going to be cold, he said. It'll keep, she said. They stayed a little longer than they needed to, in the cooling forge, in the company of the thing he'd been carrying, which had somehow become lighter for being set down in front of another person who was willing to simply look at it without flinching. It was not a perfect evening. Silas burned his hand on a coal he didn't see on the way out, and Evelyn's supper was more dried out than she'd intended, and they ate mostly without talking because they'd said the things that needed saying, and the ordinary conversation of the day felt a bit slight after it. But it was not a bad evening either. It was, in its way, the first evening they spent together that felt less like 2 strangers being careful around each other, and more like 2 people who had decided quietly and without ceremony that they were going to be in each other's corner. Which was not, Silas thought, a bad start. Not a bad start at all. November came in hard that year, the way it always did in the high country. Not gradually, not with any polite transition from autumn into cold, but as a single decisive fact, like a door slamming shut. The mountains to the west disappeared behind clouds for 3 days running, and when they reappeared they were white down to the tree line, and the people of Iron Ridge looked at them and understood that the easy season was over. Silas barely noticed the weather change except in the practical ways that mattered to his work. The coal burned hotter in the cold, which was useful, but the metal cooled faster once it left the forge, which required adjusting his timing. He'd made the adjustment so many times over so many winters that his body did it without consulting his mind. His hands knew what November meant. What his hands did not yet know how to navigate was the strange new geography of a shared life. It was not that things were going badly between him and Evelyn. It was more that things were going carefully, which was a different problem and in some ways a more difficult one. With something going badly, you knew where you stood. With something going carefully, you were perpetually uncertain whether the carefulness was wisdom or fear, and the uncertainty had a way of exhausting you gradually, like a slow leak in a water barrel. They had settled into a shape that was functional and not unpleasant. He rose before dawn, was in the forge by 5:30, worked through the morning without interruption. She rose later, managed the house in ways he was beginning to understand as having their own logic, even when they didn't immediately make sense to him, and brought his midday meal 4 days out of 5, setting it on the workbench with a brief summary of whatever she'd noticed that morning that seemed worth mentioning. Some days she had a lot to mention. Other days she handed him the food, said, "It's cold out," and left. And that was apparently a complete communication in itself. In the evenings, they ate together and the conversation was usually real. Not the performed kind, but the working kind, where two people are actually exchanging information they consider useful. She told him things about the town he hadn't known, because she went into it with fresh eyes and noticed what he'd stopped seeing. He told her things about the work, because she kept asking, and the asking had begun to feel like genuine interest rather than politeness. What they did not do, not yet, not reliably, was allow the conversation to go somewhere neither of them had planned to go. He was aware of this. He suspected she was too. They were both people who had learned, through experience of the non-theoretical kind, that letting yourself be known was a risk, and risk required trust, and trust required time. He thought they were building it. He just wasn't always sure at what speed. The town, meanwhile, had not given up. Iron Ridge had simply recalibrated. If Evelyn was not going to be horrified into leaving by Silas's face, and if Silas was not going to behave in any of the dramatic ways they'd half expected, becoming possessive, becoming volatile, giving people some concrete reason for their long-held suspicion, then the town needed a different approach. What they settled on, without explicitly discussing it, was a low-grade campaign of social pressure, the kind that leaves no fingerprints because it is made entirely of small things. Martha Bellows mentioned, in Evelyn's hearing, that it was unusual for a woman of her background to be willing to take on such a difficult situation. The word difficult was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and Evelyn heard all of it. She thanked Martha for her concern and bought her flour without further comment. The Caldwell ranch hands, who came to the forge regularly for equipment, had begun arriving slightly later in the day and lingering longer than their business required, watching Silas in the way men watch something they've decided is worth monitoring. Silas served them with the same flat professionalism he'd always shown and did not remark on the watching. But Evelyn noticed it on one of the afternoons she came by, and she stood at the forge entrance and watched them watching him until they felt the weight of it and found reasons to leave. "You don't have to do that," Silas said after they'd gone. "I know," she said. "I did it anyway." The one person in Iron Ridge who complicated all of these established patterns, who introduced something the town had not planned for and could not easily categorize, was a child named Lucy Carter. She was 9 years old, or somewhere near 9, though nobody was exactly certain because Lucy had arrived in Iron Ridge the way she seemed to do most things, without much ceremony and with very little documentation. She was an orphan in the practical sense, which was to say her mother had died of fever the previous winter, and her father had been gone long before that, and she was currently in the care of a woman named Agnes Pruitt, who ran a small boarding house on the south end of town, and who provided Lucy with a room and meals in exchange for various kinds of help around the premises, an arrangement that was legal, if not particularly warm. Lucy was small for her age, with hair that resisted all attempts at control and a face that had learned to be very composed in the way children's faces do when they've spent time in situations where showing what you feel gets you into trouble. She was observant in the particular way of children who have discovered that watching carefully is the most reliable way to understand a world that doesn't explain itself to you. She had been watching Silas Mercer for 6 months before Evelyn arrived, from a careful distance, with the dedicated attention of someone conducting a long-term study. Not because she was frightened of him. This was the thing that set her apart from most of the town's adult population, who were frightened of him to varying degrees they would each deny individually. Lucy was not frightened. She was interested. She had observed that the scarred blacksmith was the one person in Iron Ridge who didn't talk to children like they were a problem that had temporarily escaped containment, and she had observed that the things he made were extraordinary, and she had wanted, for 6 months, to ask him how he did it. She had not asked, because every time she'd gotten close enough, an adult had appeared and pulled her in another direction with a warning look that said, "Not him, not that one." And she'd learned to read those looks the way she'd learned to read most adult signals, as information about what the adults wanted, rather than information about what was actually true. Evelyn met Lucy on a Tuesday in the second week of November. She was coming back from the general store with flour and a piece of salt pork she'd talked Earl Bellows down on in price by pointing out very calmly that it had been in the case for 3 days, and he knew it. She rounded the corner near the forge and nearly walked directly into Lucy Carter, who was standing outside the forge entrance with her neck craned to see inside and her entire body radiating the particular tension of someone who wants to go somewhere and is preventing themselves. "Hello," Evelyn said. Lucy, startled, took 2 quick steps back and looked at her with the defensive composure of someone who expected to be told she was doing something wrong. "I wasn't doing anything." "I know," Evelyn said. She shifted the flour to her other arm and looked at the girl properly. Thin, cold. Her coat was not heavy enough for November. Smart eyes, the kind that moved fast. "Were you looking at the forge?" Lucy considered denying it. She clearly decided Evelyn was not the kind of person that tactic would work on. "Yes." "Do you want to see inside?" Another pause, the suspicious kind. "Why?" "Because you were looking at it," Evelyn said. "That usually means a person wants to see it." "Mr. Mercer doesn't let people in," Lucy said. "He might let you." Evelyn set down the flour sack carefully against the wall. "Stay here a moment." She went into the forge, where Silas was working. She could hear the hammer and see the fires glow from outside. She came in on his left side, which she'd learned was better. He looked up. "There's a girl outside," she said. "Lucy Carter. She wants to see the forge." He set down his hammer. "Agnes Pruitt's girl?" "She's not Pruitt's girl," Evelyn said. "She's just staying there." He considered. "She's not going to be frightened. She's been standing outside your forge for 10 minutes, trying to work up the nerve to look in. She doesn't seem frightened." He thought about it for another moment, then picked up his hammer again. "Send her in. Tell her not to touch anything without asking." Evelyn went back out. Lucy was still there, hadn't moved, which Evelyn took as a sign of genuine interest overcoming a well-developed instinct for caution. "He says you can come in. Don't touch anything without asking." Lucy's face did something complicated. Not the performance of excitement, but the real thing, a brief, involuntary widening of the eyes before she got it under control. She walked into the forge. What happened next was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no instant magical rapport, no moment where Silas crouched down and told the orphan girl something that changed her life. What happened was this. Lucy walked into the forge and stood 3 feet inside the entrance, and Silas kept working. And after about 2 minutes of silence, Lucy said, "What's that going to be?" about the piece he was working. And Silas said, "Hook, for the Caldwell tack room." And Lucy said, "It looks like a fish." And Silas looked at it. "It does a little," he said. "I can see that." And Lucy came forward another 3 feet, and Silas kept working, and Evelyn watched from the doorway for a few minutes and then picked up her flour sack and went home. Because some things don't need an audience. That evening, over supper, Silas mentioned Lucy Carter with the careful neutralness of someone who considers something worth mentioning but doesn't want to make too much of it. "She asked good questions," he said. "What kind of questions?" "About how you move the metal, why it goes one way and not another, how you know when it's hot enough." He looked at his plate. Kid thinks like an engineer. Evelyn watched him. She needs a coat, she said. I noticed that. Agnes Pruitt's not providing one? Agnes Pruitt is not known for generous provision, he said, with the flat tone he used for things he found wrong but considered not his place to say more about. Evelyn went back to eating. She was already planning something, but she kept it to herself for the moment, because she was also still learning which things Silas needed to participate in deciding and which things he preferred to simply discover had been decided reasonably. Lucy came back the next day. And the day after that. By the end of the week, she was arriving at the forge every afternoon at the same time, as regular as any of Silas's paying customers. Silas did not invite her, precisely. He never issued a formal standing invitation. He just never told her not to come back. For Lucy Carter, who had spent most of her life reading what was permitted into the gaps of what was explicitly prohibited, this was more than sufficient. She learned fast, and she was genuinely curious rather than performing curiosity for attention, which made a difference. Silas answered her questions with the same thoroughness he'd have applied to any technical question, not simplifying in ways that were condescending, not elaborating past the point of usefulness. She absorbed what he told her, asked follow-up questions that demonstrated she'd actually processed the first answer, and did not chatter or fill silence for the sake of filling it. He didn't realize until the second week that he'd started looking forward to the 4 o'clock hour. Evelyn realized before he did. She watched him in the evenings when he talked about whatever Lucy had asked that day, the way the particular flatness he usually carried around with him, the quality of self-containment that years of isolation had built up like callus over everything, thinned a little when he was talking about the child's questions. Not much, but enough that she could see it. She didn't say anything about it. She just filed it, the way she filed most things, under what is actually true about this man. What was also true, and this was the part that was beginning to bother her, not quietly, but with the persistent low-grade quality of a sound you can't quite locate, was the way the town treated him when she was not there to see it. She was careful about this. She didn't go looking for it, and she didn't position herself as a witness to it deliberately, because she knew that Silas had been managing the town's treatment of him for 11 years and would consider her interference more complicated than helpful. But she also had eyes, and the town was small, and things happened in plain sight. She saw the way men crossed to the other side of the street when Silas was walking on an errand. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough, and consistently enough, that it was a pattern and not coincidence. She saw the way conversations dropped in the general store when he came in, the way Earl Bellows served him quickly, and without the extended pleasantry he offered to other customers, the way the Caldwell ranch hands who came to him for work would talk to his hands or his workbench rather than his face. And she saw once something that sat with her for days afterward. She had been at the general store in the late afternoon, waiting for Earl to locate the particular grade of thread she'd asked for, when Silas came in for coal delivery documentation. Routine business, the kind he handled weekly. He came in, acknowledged Earl with a nod, stated his business. Earl produced the paperwork. And in the space between Silas entering and the paperwork being produced, a woman Evelyn didn't know well, Mrs. Cathcart, whose husband managed the lumber supply, had picked up her young son, maybe 4 years old, and moved him pointedly to the far corner of the store, not because the child had been in Silas's way, just because. Silas had seen it. His face showed nothing. He had, Evelyn was beginning to understand, spent 11 years developing a face that showed nothing in public, not because he felt nothing, but because showing it had never gotten him anything but more of the same. He completed his transaction, said thank you to Earl, and left. Evelyn finished her purchase. She walked home. She did not say anything to Silas that evening because she knew that whatever she said would land wrong, either too much sympathy, which would feel like pity, or not enough acknowledgement, which would feel like indifference. What she did instead was sit with the knowledge of it. Sit with the specific weight of watching someone absorb something small and terrible without moving, the way water absorbs an impact without breaking, and understand that he had been doing this day after day for 11 years, and that the cumulative weight of all those small and terrible things was somewhere inside him, packed down under 11 years of learned silence. She was angry, not explosive angry, the kind that burns itself out quickly and leaves nothing, the steady kind, the kind that clarifies. She did not yet know what she was going to do with it. What happened next arrived from a direction she hadn't expected, which was, in retrospect, how the important things usually arrived. It was Lucy. Specifically, it was a Thursday afternoon, about 3 weeks into November, when Lucy arrived at the forge at her usual 4 o'clock and set something on Silas's workbench before even saying hello. It was a small iron horse, badly made, which is to say made by someone who had no training and limited tools, clearly hammered out of scrap metal with enormous concentration and very little technical knowledge. The legs were uneven, the neck was too thick. The tail was more suggestion than fact. Silas looked at it for a long moment, then he looked at Lucy. "Where did you get scrap iron?" he asked. "Behind the livery," she said, with the straightforward composure of someone who does not see this as a complicating answer. "And what did you use?" "A rock," she said. "Mostly, and the edge of the fence post for the flat parts." He picked it up and turned it in his hands. The horse was terrible by any technical standard, but there was something in it, not skill, but intention. Whoever had made this had looked at something in their head and tried, with what they had, to make the world match it. "How long did this take you?" he asked. 2 days, she said. The legs kept being wrong. "They're still wrong," he said. But he said it in the way he said things that were true, and not the way he said things intended to discourage. Lucy looked at the horse in his hands. "I know. I couldn't figure out how to make them even." "Even legs on a standing animal are about weight distribution," he said. "The base has to be right before anything else can be right." He set it down on the workbench and looked at her. "You want to make another one?" She looked at him steadily. "Can I?" "Yes," he said, "but we'll do it right this time. And you'll stop taking scrap iron from behind the livery, because Tom Hennessy will notice eventually, and he'll take it out on Agnes Pruitt, and that'll come back to you sideways." Lucy considered this. "Where do I get it from, then?" "From me," he said. "I have scrap." They spent the next 2 hours working on the horse together. It was not a finished product at the end of those 2 hours. They got as far as the body and the basic leg structure before the light went and Silas called it. But what it was real work, real instruction. He showed her what he meant about weight distribution, showed her how to read the metal for where it wanted to go and where it would resist, showed her how to use the heat and not fight it. Lucy listened the way she always listened, completely, with those fast, careful eyes that missed nothing. Evelyn, coming by near the end to check on progress, and finding the two of them bent over the workbench in the forge light with the small, malformed horse between them, stopped in the doorway and felt something shift inside her chest. Not sentimentality. She was not, by temperament, a sentimental woman. Something more like recognition. The recognition of something that had been absent from 2 different lives finally being present, and neither of those 2 people quite knowing what to call it, but going toward it anyway. She went home and started supper without interrupting them. Later, when Silas came in smelling of coal smoke and brought the small iron horse and set it on the kitchen table without comment, she looked at it and then looked at him. "She's got good hands," he said, "for a kid." "Yes," Evelyn agreed. He sat down. She put food in front of him and sat across from him, and they were quiet for a moment, both of them looking at the malformed little horse with its uneven legs and too thick neck, sitting in the middle of their kitchen table like something that mattered. "She needs a coat," Silas said. Evelyn looked at him. "I know. I'm not made of... I don't just give things away," he said, which was a sentence that was trying to be a disclaimer and failing at it. "Of course not," she said. "But a coat is practical. Very practical." He picked up his fork. "I could make her something else," he said, "while she's learning, something she can keep, so she has a reason to come back when the learning part stops being interesting." Evelyn thought about this. "The horse," she said. "When it's finished." He nodded. "The horse." They went back to eating. The iron horse sat between them on the table, catching the lamplight on its rough, imperfect surface. And neither of them talked about what it actually meant. About the child who had appeared in the forge with a rock-hammered piece of scrap metal. About the man who had seen something in it worth encouraging. About the woman who had watched them both and understood something she wasn't yet sure how to say. Some things, Evelyn had learned, didn't need to be said immediately. Sometimes you just had to let them settle into the shape they were going to take before you tried to put words around them. The coat was left on Agnes Pruitt's front step 3 days later, wrapped in paper, with no note. Lucy appeared at the forge the following afternoon wearing it. She didn't mention it. Silas didn't mention it. The coat was the right size, which was not accidental because Evelyn had noted Lucy's measurements with the careful eye of someone who had spent years fitting clothes to bodies that weren't present. Life in Iron Ridge had this quality, Evelyn was discovering. It was not cinematic. It did not arrange itself into obvious moments with clear before and afters. It moved in the small, incremental way of real things, where you only recognized the turning points after you'd already turned. What she did not know yet, what neither she nor Silas knew, moving through those November days in the careful building way they were moving, was that the town's patience with their quiet life was not going to last. That a man like Harlan Graves, who owned more land than anyone in the county, and whose tolerance for things that defied his expectations was precisely zero, had been watching the Mercer household with the specific displeasure of someone who has decided that a wrong answer has been given to a question he considers settled. He had not yet said anything. He was the kind of man who waited for the right moment, who understood that public humiliation required an audience, and that the right moment was the one where the audience was largest and the target least prepared. That moment was coming. Neither Silas nor Evelyn felt it approaching, which was perhaps the only mercy available. Those 3 weeks of November, with the cold settling in and the forge burning and Lucy arriving every afternoon at 4 o'clock and the small iron horse slowly taking better shape on the corner of the workbench. Those weeks were not perfect. There were arguments, small and specific, about the mallet on the table again, about Evelyn going out in weather. Silas considered too cold without telling him, about money and how much they had and how much they needed. The ordinary friction of two people negotiating a shared life. There was still the careful quality to things, the sense of learning a language neither of them was entirely fluent in yet. But there was also this. On a Thursday night in the 3rd week of November, a sleeting rain came in off the mountains and turned the world outside the windows into a gray, formless sound, and they sat by the stove after supper, not talking much, Evelyn mending something, Silas working on a small piece at the kitchen table by lamplight. And the room was warm, and the rain was loud, and the horse was on the shelf where Evelyn had moved it. And Silas looked up from his work and found her looking at him, and held the look for a moment without looking away. And she didn't look away either, and that was something. It was not everything, but it was something real, built out of all the small, imperfect, carefully accumulated days that had come before it, and it held. Outside, Iron Ridge kept its opinions to itself for the night, and the rain came down, and the forge went cold in the dark, and the iron horse waited on the shelf with its uneven legs and its too thick neck, a thing made imperfectly by hands that were learning, which was, when you thought about it, more or less what all of them were doing. The iron horse was finished on the first Saturday of December. Silas set it on the workbench in the morning light and turned it slowly with both hands, examining it the way he examined all finished pieces, not looking for what was right, but for what was still wrong, because what was right didn't need his attention anymore. The legs were even this time. The neck had the right proportion. The tail curved with something approaching actual movement in it, the suggestion of an animal that had somewhere to be. It was not a masterpiece. It was a competent, honest piece of craft made by two people at very different skill levels, one teaching and one learning, and the result carried the evidence of both. Lucy arrived at 4 o'clock as usual and saw it immediately. She didn't say anything for a moment. She walked up to the workbench and stood in front of it and looked at it the way she looked at things she was trying to memorize. Then she picked it up carefully. She'd learned careful from 3 weeks of working with hot metal and sharp edges, and turned it the way she'd watched Silas turn finished pieces. "It's right," she said. "The left rear leg is a hair longer than the others," Silas said. "You can feel it if you set it on a flat surface." She set it on the workbench, looked, tipped it the fraction that the uneven leg produced. "Does it matter?" He considered the question honestly. For a functional piece, yes. For something that's just going to stand on a shelf, probably not. She picked it up again. "It's mine?" "That's what I said." She held it against her chest with both hands, not dramatically, just holding it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to keep it." "I figured," he said, and went back to work. Evelyn heard about the finished horse that evening when Lucy stopped by the house on her way back to Agnes Pruitt's, which she'd started doing occasionally over the past 2 weeks. Not staying long, never overstaying, but stopping by with the self-possessed brevity of someone who has decided a place is worth visiting without wanting to make too much of the decision. She showed Evelyn the horse with the same contained composure she'd shown in the forge, and Evelyn held it and looked at it properly and said, "The tail is good," because it was. And Lucy received the specific compliment with the same seriousness it was offered. After Lucy left, Evelyn set supper on the table and Silas came in from closing up the forge, and they ate, and it was an ordinary evening in most respects, except that somewhere in the middle of it, without either of them having planned to talk about Lucy, they were talking about Lucy. About the coat that still fit well, about the questions she'd asked that week, about Agnes Pruitt's household and what it actually provided and what it didn't. "She's not unhappy," Evelyn said, "but she's not. Looked after, not the way a child should be." Silas was quiet. "I'm not suggesting anything," Evelyn added, which was not entirely true, but she was also genuinely uncertain what she was suggesting, so the disclaimer was at least partially honest. "I know," he said. "I just think about her," she said. "Going back to that house. I think about it too," he said, which cost him something to admit she could tell, though she wasn't sure he'd have been able to explain exactly what. They let it sit there between them, not resolved, not dismissed. Just present, the way some things have to be present for a while before they become clear. December settled over Iron Ridge with the particular thoroughness of high country winters, which had no interest in being picturesque and a great deal of interest in being serious. The temperature dropped hard in the second week and stayed down, and the main street became a gauntlet of frozen mud ruts that caught wagon wheels and ankles with equal indifference. The mountains were invisible behind cloud and snow for days at a stretch, and the town contracted inward the way it always did in deep cold. People moving faster between buildings, conversations getting shorter, the general disposition shading toward functional rather than sociable. It was in this contracted, cold-pinched version of Iron Ridge that Harlan Graves decided the time had come. Silas had known Harlan Graves the way everyone in Iron Ridge knew him, as a fact, like the weather or the elevation, something you accounted for without much expectation of changing. Graves owned the largest cattle operation in the county, a spread that ran from the south end of the valley up into the foothills, and he ran it the way he ran everything in his life, which was with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything in his own estimation. He was 53 years old, broad through the chest, with a face that had settled into the permanent expression of someone who finds most of the world slightly below standard. He had been a customer of Silas's forge for 6 years. Not a friendly customer. He sent ranch hands to place orders and rarely came in person, but a consistent one, because Silas's ironwork was the best available, and Graves was too practical to let personal distaste override functional advantage. He paid what was owed. Silas delivered what was promised. The arrangement had the cold efficiency of two people who understand they need something from each other and have decided not to pretend otherwise. What had changed in Graves's private accounting was the advertisement and its outcome. The marriage, the wife, the particular affront, and he would not have used that word himself, but it was the right one, of watching the town's scarred, solitary blacksmith acquire, against all reasonable expectation, something that looked like a life. Silas could not have explained exactly why this bothered Harlan Graves. He wasn't sure it was possible to explain, really, because the explanation lived in a part of human nature that didn't like being examined too directly. The part that had decided years ago what certain people deserved and what they didn't, and felt obscurely threatened when the world failed to uphold those decisions. What he knew was that Graves had been paying his account in cash, hand-delivered, for 6 years, and that the most recent payment for the gate ironwork completed in October had not arrived. 3 weeks past due, which was not Graves's pattern. Silas had sent a written notice through the ranch foreman, as was standard procedure. No response. So on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, with the temperature at something well below tolerable and the sky the color of old pewter, Silas put on his heavier coat and walked to the general store, where he knew from long experience that Harlan Graves conducted informal business on Tuesday mornings. He should have waited. That was what he knew, later, looking back. He should have sent another written notice, given it another 2 weeks, gone through formal channels. But he was also a man who was owed money for work he'd done, and he was also, though he would have been slow to name it, a man who was increasingly tired of arranging his behavior around other people's comfort. Graves was there, as expected, standing at the counter with two of his ranch hands and talking to Earl Bellows about some supply matter. 3 or 4 other people in the store, Mrs. Hartwell from the fabric end of town, a couple of men Silas recognized from the lumber supply. Silas came in and waited. He was good at waiting. He stood near the door with his hands at his sides and let Graves finish what he was saying to Earl, and then Graves turned and saw him, and his expression went through a brief, visible adjustment, from mild surprise to something more deliberate. "Mercer," Graves said. "Mr. Graves." Silas kept his voice level, which cost less than it once had. "I'm here about the October payment. It's 3 weeks past the agreed date." Graves looked at him for a moment. The store had gone quiet in the way stores do when the conversation in them shifts from ordinary to loaded. Silas felt it, the quality of attention in the room, but he kept his eyes on Graves. "I've had some concerns about the quality of that gate ironwork," Graves said. Silas had not been expecting that. He stood with it for a moment, because he knew his own work and he knew the gate ironwork had been done properly, and he also knew that this was not a conversation about gate ironwork. "What concerns?" he said. "The latch mechanism." Graves said it flatly, without specifics, with the confidence of a man who knows he doesn't need to be specific. "My foreman's had trouble with it." "Your foreman is welcome to bring the mechanism to me," Silas said. "If there's a fault in my work, I'll fix it without charge. That's always been my practice." "Maybe so." Graves let a beat of silence go by, the kind that's intended to be heard as consideration but is actually already decided. "But maybe I'm not comfortable continuing business with a man who's—" He stopped. The pause was calculated, the pause of someone choosing words that will do the most work. Whose situation has changed? The store was completely quiet now. Even Earl Bellows had stopped pretending to organize things behind the counter. "Situation," Silas said. "You've brought a woman into town," Graves said. "A stranger. Nobody knows her people. She's been—" Another pause. Another calculated choice. "Inserting herself into things that are settled." "She's my wife," Silas said. "What she does is her concern and mine. This is a community," Graves said. And now there was something harder under the words, something that had been waiting to come out. And a community has standards about who belongs and who doesn't, about what kind of presentation is appropriate. His eyes moved briefly to the right side of Silas's face. It was not an accident. Some of us feel that a man in your position ought to have a clear understanding of his place in it. In the 11 years since the fire, Silas had been looked at in a great many ways. He had been looked at with horror, and with pity, and with the specific cowardly blankness of people who had decided the easiest response to him was to pretend he wasn't fully present. He had absorbed all of it, with the practiced stillness he'd developed, because the alternatives, rage, bitterness, the kind of public grief that would have given the town exactly what it seemed to want from him, had always seemed like worse options. He stood in Earl Bellows' general store in the second week of December and felt the familiar heat of all of it, and kept his hands where they were, and kept his voice where it was. "I'll be expecting payment by end of week, Mr. Graves," he said. "The work was done to standard. You know it was." He turned to leave. "It's a curiosity to me," Graves said, louder now, addressing the room as much as Silas. "What kind of woman comes all this way for—" His voice had taken on the tone of a man performing for an audience he knows is listening. "For that." Silas stopped. He stood with his hand not quite on the door, and stood with that sentence which had been aimed with precision at the thing that was hardest to absorb. Not the comment about his face, because he'd heard those for 11 years, but the comment about Evelyn. The implication that her choice was aberrant, that her judgment was defective, that what she'd found in him was something to be explained rather than something that simply was. He turned back around. "I'll expect payment by Friday," he said. His voice was entirely level. He walked out. The cold hit him when he came through the door, and he stood on the boardwalk for a moment in it, not because he needed to collect himself, but because the space between the door and the street felt like the right place to let the morning settle before he moved through it. He did not tell Evelyn about it that evening. He wasn't sure why, exactly. Partly because he'd spent 11 years not telling anyone about things like that, and the habit was deeply grooved. Partly because he wasn't sure what telling her would accomplish. And partly And this was the part that he examined in the quieter spaces of the night and didn't entirely like, because there was a small, stubborn, wrong part of him that still wanted to protect her from the particular ugliness of it. Not from weakness, just from... He didn't have a good word for it. The wish, maybe, that one person in his life didn't have to see all of it. What he hadn't accounted for was that Evelyn had already seen most of it, and that what she hadn't seen yet, she was capable of finding out. Martha Bellows told her, not out of cruelty. This was the complicated thing about Martha Bellows, that she was not fundamentally a cruel woman, just a woman who had not thought very carefully about the difference between sharing information and causing damage. She told Evelyn on Wednesday afternoon, in the general store, with the slightly righteous air of someone delivering news they believe the recipient deserves to have. "I thought you should know," Martha said, "what Harlan Graves said in here yesterday, about you and Silas." Evelyn listened to all of it without interrupting. She was good at that. The listening without interrupting, the receiving of information without letting your face tell the other person what they want to see. Martha, who had hoped for some kind of reaction she could report back on, got very little. "Thank you for telling me," Evelyn said when Martha finished. "It was a terrible thing to say," Martha offered, with the tone of someone opening a door for agreement. "Yes," Evelyn said, "it was." She bought what she'd come for and went home. She didn't say anything to Silas that evening either. She needed to think, and she knew the kind of thinking she needed to do wasn't the kind that benefited from being spoken out loud before it was finished. What she was thinking about was not, primarily, Harlan Graves. Graves was a bully with an economic advantage and an audience, and she'd known men like that before, and she had a reasonably clear idea of how they operated. What she was thinking about was Silas. Specifically, about the particular quality of stillness he'd carried for the past 2 days. Not his usual working stillness, but something different, something tighter, the stillness of a man holding something compressed. She'd seen it before, that quality. She'd seen it in the forge the night he told her about the fire. She'd seen it in small moments when the town's treatment of him was particularly visible and he absorbed it without moving. She was beginning to understand that Silas's stillness was not always peace. Sometimes it was the alternative to a feeling that had nowhere safe to go. She thought about 11 years of that, about a man who had done something genuinely courageous, who had carried the physical evidence of it on his face every day, and who had been asked by the town around him to be ashamed of both the evidence and the courage, who had so thoroughly internalized the expectation that he kept quiet and took up as little space as possible that he hadn't told his own wife what had been said about her in a public room. That last part was the part that clarified everything. The payment did not arrive by Friday. Silas mentioned it at supper, briefly, as a practical matter. "Graves hasn't paid." "I know what he said in the store," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Martha Bellows." "Yes." He set down his fork. He had the expression of a man deciding whether to be frustrated that she knew, and then deciding that was the wrong thing to be frustrated about. "I was going to handle it." "I know you were," she said. "How?" "Send another notice. Give it until the new year. Take it to the county seat if necessary." "And what he said about me?" He was quiet. "Silas." She waited until he looked at her. "What he said about me?" "He's a bully," he said. "He says things in public because he knows people will hear them. The best response is usually, 'To ignore it,'" she said. "Yes." "I know. That's what you've been doing for 11 years. She said it without accusation, just plainly. "I'm not you." He looked at her for a long moment. "What are you thinking about doing?" "I'm thinking about going to the store on Saturday morning," she said. "When it's busy?" He was very still. "Evelyn, I'm not going to make a scene," she said. "I don't do scenes. But I'm not going to sit in this house and let a man say that about you in front of half the town and treat it as something to wait out." She picked up her fork again. "He owes you money for work you did. He said what he said because he thought you'd take it, like you've taken everything else. I want to be there when he finds out that's changed." Silas looked at his plate. He looked like a man working through several responses simultaneously, none of which quite fit. "You don't have to defend me," he said finally. The words came out rougher than he intended. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's not why I'm doing it." "Then why?" She thought about how to say it because the honest answer was not a simple one. Because you told the truth in that advertisement, she said. You told the truth when nobody expected you to. You told it about your face and about the fire and about what you wanted, and most people in that situation would have softened it, made it easier for someone to say yes. You didn't. She paused. I came out here for that. Not for a man with a fixed face and a clean past. For the one who told the truth when it cost him something. And I'm not going to sit quietly while someone stands in a public room and treats that man like he's something to be pitied or dismissed. Silas didn't say anything for a while. The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind had picked up, making its usual claim on the gaps in the siding. He'll have people with him, he said finally. He usually does on Saturday mornings. Good, she said. Then more people will hear it. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, the sky above Iron Ridge a hard, pale blue with no cloud in it. Evelyn dressed practically, which was the only way she dressed, and went to the general store at 9 o'clock, which was when it was busiest. Ranch hands coming in for supplies, townspeople doing their weekly shopping, the loose, sociable crowd that gathered on Saturday mornings when the week's work eased and people had a few minutes to talk. Silas came with her. She hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't announced it. He'd simply finished his breakfast and put on his coat when she put on hers, and when she'd looked at him, he'd said, I want to pay what I owe Earl for the coal account, which was true but also not the only reason, and she hadn't pressed on it. They walked in together. The store was full, as she'd expected, at least 12 people visible, and she could hear more in the back near the hardware. Martha Bellows was behind the fabric counter. Earl was at the register. 3 of the Caldwell ranch hands near the door, the 2 lumbermen from before, a family she didn't know well from the north side of town, and Harlan Graves at the counter, in conversation with Earl about something. He saw them come in. She watched his face do the calculation, taking in Silas, taking in her beside Silas, understanding that this was not an accidental arrival. The store didn't go quiet immediately. The quiet happened in waves as people noticed and their conversations trailed off, and the attention of the room shifted, the way water shifts when something heavy is set in it. Evelyn walked to the counter. She did not walk quickly or slowly. She walked the way she'd walked across Main Street on the first day, when she'd come off the stagecoach and seen him standing there, with the posture of someone who has made a decision and is seeing it through. She stopped a few feet from Graves. She looked at him directly. He was a big man, and he had the particular confidence of big men who have also been wealthy for a long time, and he looked back at her with the expression of someone who is deciding how much trouble this is going to be. Mr. Graves, she said. Her voice was even. Not loud. She didn't need loud. The store was quiet enough that everything was being heard. My husband did work for you in October, gate ironwork. You've had the invoice for 3 weeks. Graves's jaw shifted. This isn't the place. You chose the general store on Tuesday to say what you said, Evelyn said. So I think it's exactly the right place. She paused. You said you had concerns about the quality of the work. My husband offered to examine any fault at no charge, which is more than fair. If there's a genuine problem with the mechanism, tell us now and we'll fix it this week. I said my foreman had trouble with the latch, Graves said. That's a legitimate concern. Then bring the latch to the forge, she said. Today, if you like. Silas will look at it in front of you. She paused. But I think we both know the latch isn't what this is about. The room was absolutely silent now. She could feel it. 12 people, 15, not moving, barely breathing, the particular held quality of a crowd that is watching something real and knows it. Graves looked at her with the specific anger of a man who is used to being the most dangerous person in any given conversation and is now uncertain whether that's true. Your husband, he said slowly, has been a fixture of this town for a long time. People here have certain understandings about how things work. Tell me about the understandings, she said. He didn't say anything. On Tuesday, she said, you implied that the kind of woman I am was questionable because I married a man with scars. She kept her voice level, but she did not keep it quiet. Every person in that store was hearing every word. I'd like to clear something up for this town since I'm fairly new and there may be things you haven't heard. She turned, not theatrically, just because she was going to speak to the room now, not just to Graves, and she looked at the people around her. Martha Bellows, the ranch hands, the family from the North End. These scars on my husband's face, the ones that Mr. Graves seems to feel say something about his worth. He got them 11 years ago, pulling 3 people out of a burning house in January, a woman and 2 children. The house was gone. They were not. She paused. He didn't do it because someone told him to. He did it because he was the closest and it needed doing, and he came out of that fire looking the way he looks. And this town, by and large, has spent 11 years treating that as a reason to keep its distance from him. The silence had a different quality now, not the held, anticipatory silence of an audience waiting for something to happen, but something heavier, more still, the silence of a room that has heard something it needed to hear and is now sitting with the weight of it. She turned back to Graves. "You stood safely aside while he went in," she said. Not loudly. She didn't need loud. "I don't know exactly where you were that night, maybe nearby, maybe further away, but you were not the one who went in, and you've spent 11 years looking at the man who did and finding reasons to look down at him." Her voice didn't rise, it just got more precise. "You owe him for the gate iron work. The work was done to standard, and you know it. I'd like that paid by end of business today." Harlan Graves stood at Earl Bellows' counter and did not say anything for a long moment. The room watched him. He was a man who had never, in a long public life, been in a position where there was nothing good to say, where every response available to him was worse than silence. He could get loud, and the room would see a man getting loud at a woman who had told the truth. He could deny what she'd said about the fire, and someone in the room almost certainly knew enough to contradict him. He could find a way to make this about something else, and the room would see that clearly for what it was. He was also a man who could do arithmetic. He reached into his coat and produced a wallet. He counted out the correct amount and set it on the counter without a word, with the deliberate control of a man who is furious and has decided that showing it would cost more than the money. He picked up his hat. He looked at Evelyn once, a flat, cold look, and then he walked out of the store. The door closed behind him. Evelyn turned to Earl. "I'll take the flour and the salt, if you have it, Earl." Earl Bellows, who had stood behind his counter through the whole of it, with an expression that moved through several phases, discomfort, alarm, something that looked briefly like admiration, said, "Yes, ma'am," and went to get them. Silas was standing near the door. He'd been there through all of it, and she hadn't looked at him directly while she was speaking, because she needed to say what she was saying without performing it for him. She looked at him now. His face, both sides of it, was doing something that was not his usual public stillness. It was something more complicated, more exposed. She held the look for a moment, and then she turned to the business of paying Earl. She heard, behind her, one of the Caldwell ranch hands say something low to the man next to him. She couldn't make out the exact words, but the tone was different from what she'd heard before from that direction. Less the tone of men observing something they've decided to dismiss, and more the tone of men revising something they'd thought was settled. Martha Bellows, from behind the fabric counter, caught Evelyn's eye when Evelyn was turning to go. Martha had the look of a woman who has just watched her understanding of something shift in a way that was going to require some quiet adjustment on her own part. She didn't say anything, but she nodded. A small nod, specific and real. On the walk home, the money for the gate ironwork tucked in Evelyn's coat pocket, the flour under Silas's arm. They didn't talk for a while. The cold was still sharp, the blue sky still hard and clear above the roof lines. Then Silas said, "You knew I was there." "Yes," she said. "You didn't look at me." "I couldn't," she said. "If I'd looked at you, I'd have thought about how you were feeling about it instead of about what I was saying." He was quiet for a moment. "And you knew what I was feeling anyway." She glanced at him sideways. "I had a reasonable guess." "What was the guess?" She thought about it honestly. "That you didn't want me to do it," she said, "and that you were glad I was." He didn't confirm or deny it. He walked beside her in the December cold, carrying the flour, and the silence between them was not the careful kind, not the negotiated kind. It was the kind that forms between people who have stopped needing every moment to be explained. She thought about what Lucy's face had looked like when she first saw the finished iron horse. That involuntary widening, that moment of real feeling before composure reasserted itself. She thought about what Silas's face had looked like just now in Earl's store. when she'd turned and found him watching. She thought about all the things those two expressions had in common. They got home. Silas put the flower away, which was new. He was learning where things lived. Evelyn put on water for coffee, which was also becoming a pattern of its own. The particular patterns that accumulate into a household, into a life, without anyone sitting down and deciding that's what they're doing. "He won't forget it," Silas said, from the table.
"No," she agreed, "but he'll be careful about it next time. Men like Graves only do that in public when they think nobody's going to push back." "You pushed back," he said. "We pushed back," she said. "You were there." He looked at his hands on the table. "I didn't say anything." "You came," she said. "That was enough." He looked up at her. The morning light came through the kitchen window and caught both sides of his face, the unmarked left and the scarred right, with equal indifference, the way good light usually does. He looked like what he was, a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and was beginning slowly and with considerable uncertainty to consider setting some of it down. "Evelyn," he said, then stopped. She waited. "I'm not sure I know how to—" He stopped again, tried a different approach. "I've been alone a long time. Some of the things that come with that I can fix. Some of them I can't fix as fast." "I know," she said. "I don't want you to think I don't—" Another stop. He was clearly someone who had no trouble with physical precision and considerable trouble with emotional precision, and she watched him work on it with the same patience she'd applied to understanding his silences. "Silas," she said, "I know." He looked at her. "I didn't come all this way because I expected something easy," she said. "I came because you told the truth, and you keep telling it, even when it costs you." She set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him. "That's enough. That's more than enough." He nodded. Not the nod of a man agreeing to something in the moment, the slower nod of a man absorbing something he's going to need to think about later, in the quiet, in the forge, when his hands are busy and his head has the room to work through what his voice couldn't manage in real time. Outside, Iron Ridge was doing whatever it does on cold Saturday mornings. Somewhere down Main Street, Harlan Graves was riding south toward his property with his money paid and his dignity rearranged. Somewhere on the south end of town, Lucy Carter was probably doing something she hadn't been given permission for and was going to be fine. The mountains were visible today, white and immovable, the way they always were when the sky cleared. In the kitchen of the house on the north end of Main Street, 2 people sat across from each other and drank their coffee in the good kind of silence, the kind built out of all the difficult things they'd managed to say to each other and all the things that didn't need saying anymore. It was not a perfect morning. The coffee was too strong, the way it always was when Silas made it, and the draft from the window still hadn't been properly fixed, and outside the world was hard and cold and full of people who were going to take time to change, if they changed at all. Nothing had been solved completely. Nothing is, not ever, not in real life. But something had shifted in the weight of things, and both of them felt it, in the way you feel a change in pressure before weather, the way you feel a load redistributed on a shoulder that's been carrying it too long. Something had moved, and what was left was lighter, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The change in Iron Ridge did not happen the way change happens in stories, all at once, with a clear before and after that everyone could point to. It happened the way ice thaws in a mountain creek, from the edges inward, inconsistently, with setbacks when the temperature dropped again, and progress that was only visible if you paid attention over time, rather than day to day. The Saturday at Earl Bellows's store had done something, though. That much was undeniable. It had done something to the room's understanding of what was true, which is the only way any town's understanding of anything actually shifts. Not through argument, not through goodwill, but through a moment when the version of reality that people have been carrying around in their heads is replaced, publicly and without ambiguity, by the actual version. Harlan Graves left Iron Ridge in the 2nd week of January. Not permanently. He had too much land and too much investment in the county to simply leave. But he took himself and 2 of his ranch hands south to his winter grazing operation and was not seen on Main Street for nearly 2 months. Nobody said out loud that this had anything to do with what had happened in the general store, but nobody was confused about it either. In his absence, the particular quality of pressure that his presence had maintained, the unspoken social authorization he'd provided for everyone else's smaller cruelties, relaxed,
Not all at once, and not completely, but enough that other things could begin to happen. Tom Hennessy from the livery came into the forge on a Monday morning in January, not for business, but to talk. He stood near the entrance with his hat in his hands and told Silas he'd heard what had happened in December, meaning the fire, meaning the Whitmore family, which had apparently been discussed in some detail among the town's residents in the weeks following the store confrontation. He said he'd worked in Iron Ridge for 8 years and hadn't known. He said he was sorry for that, in the blunt, uncomfortable way men apologize when they're genuinely sorry, but have no practice at it. Silas listened. He didn't tell Hennessy it was fine because it wasn't entirely fine. He didn't make it easier, but he also didn't make it harder. He said, "I appreciate you saying so," and meant it, and Hennessy nodded and put his hat back on and left, and that was the whole of it. Small thing. But Silas came home that evening and mentioned it, and Evelyn listened, and neither of them made too much of it, which was the right response. The Caldwell Ranch hands stopped watching him with the monitoring quality they'd maintained for months. They still weren't warm. They were ranch hands, not a warm demographic by inclination, but they started having the ordinary functional conversations about work and weather that they'd been withholding for reasons that now seemed, even to them probably, a little thin. One of them, a young man named Pete, who'd started on the Caldwell spread the previous spring, began stopping at the forge not for equipment but to watch, with the kind of transparent fascination that Silas recognized from a different direction. Because it was the same fascination that lived in Lucy Carter's careful eyes every afternoon at 4 o'clock. He didn't say anything about it the first 2 times. On the 3rd time he said, "You want to ask something?" Pete looked caught. "Just watching how you do the weld on those hinges." "It's a lap weld," Silas said. "Temperature has to be right across the whole contact area, not just in the middle." He held up the piece. "You want to see the angle?" Pete came forward and looked. Silas showed him without elaborating beyond what was useful, and the young man asked 1 or 2 questions that revealed he'd been genuinely paying attention and then went back to whatever he was supposed to be doing that afternoon. Evelyn heard about that one too. She was quiet for a moment after he told her, and then she said, "You know that's going to keep happening." "What is?" "People coming to look, younger ones especially." She set down the mending she'd been working on. "You're a good teacher, Silas. Lucy figured that out in the first week." He was quiet in the way he was quiet when someone said something that landed in a place he hadn't expected. "I'm not a teacher. I'm a blacksmith." "A blacksmith who explains things clearly and doesn't make people feel stupid for not already knowing them," she said. "That's a teacher, whether you call it that or not." He didn't argue, but he didn't agree out loud either, which she'd learned was often how he processed things that turned out, later, to have settled. Lucy came every day through January and into February. The Iron Horse lived on a shelf above her cot at Agnes Pruitt's, in the specific place of something that is not a decoration but an anchor, something you arrange your sense of home around even when home is a temporary and not particularly warm arrangement. She'd told Evelyn this without calling it that. She'd described the shelf and where the horse sat and how she'd moved it twice before finding the right spot. And Evelyn had listened and understood exactly what was being communicated without remarking on it directly, because remarking on it directly would have made Lucy close up the way she closed up when she felt observed. What Evelyn had done instead was put a second hook on the kitchen wall, at a height that made sense for a child, and started leaving Lucy's coat on it when she came by. Just a small thing, just a place for something to belong. Lucy noticed. She didn't say anything, but she started coming by more and staying a little longer, and she stopped holding herself quite so precisely at the door before coming in. The careful posture of a child who is checking whether she's still welcome before committing her weight to the threshold. It was Silas who finally named it. On a February evening when Lucy had stayed for supper for the 3rd time that week and had fallen asleep in the chair by the stove while Evelyn was cleaning up, the Iron Horse clutched loosely in one hand and her head tilted sideways in the particular abandon of a child's sleep, which holds nothing back. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn across the kitchen. "We should talk to Agnes Pruitt," he said quietly. Evelyn set down the dish she was drying. She'd been waiting for him to say it, or something like it, for a month. She'd been careful not to push because this was the kind of thing that had to come from both of them at the same pace, and pushing it before he was ready would have made it about her wanting it rather than about what was actually right. "What would we say?" she asked. That she's here most of the time anyway, he said. That she's not. He stopped. Tried again. Agnes isn't bad to her, but Agnes is doing what she can manage, not what the child actually needs. No, Evelyn agreed. They were both quiet, watching Lucy sleep. The stove ticked. Outside, the February wind was doing its usual work on the building, finding every gap with professional thoroughness.
I don't know how to do this, he said. Not the legal part. The legal part was a matter of talking to the county, paperwork, practical things he knew how to manage. I mean, I don't know how to be. Neither do I, Evelyn said. I haven't done it before either. You seem more prepared. I'm better at hiding that I'm not prepared, she said. It's not the same thing. Same.
He looked at her. Then, unexpectedly, he made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not a performed laugh, just a brief, involuntary release of something that was partly humor and partly relief that she'd said a true thing that made the situation slightly less enormous. Fair enough, he said. They agreed to talk to Agnes Pruitt that week. Agnes, as it turned out, received the conversation with the practical resignation of a woman who had known it was coming and was mostly relieved not to have to bring it up herself. She was not a villain. She'd taken Lucy in because someone had to, and she'd done what she could, which had not been much beyond the basics. She said she thought it was a good idea. She said the girl had been spending most of her time on the north end of town anyway, as if she'd already decided where she belonged and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The legal process took 6 weeks, which was not slow for the county. The paperwork was handled by the county magistrate in Pueblo, who came through Iron Ridge on his quarterly circuit and conducted the necessary interviews with the thoroughness of a man who took the work seriously. He interviewed Silas and Evelyn separately. He interviewed Agnes Pruitt. He spoke with Lucy, alone, in the front room of the magistrate's temporary office at the post office, and whatever Lucy said in that room, she did not report back to anyone. What she did do the evening after the interview was arrive at the house on the north end of Main Street and sit down at the kitchen table and look at Evelyn directly. He asked me where I wanted to be, she said. What did you tell him? Evelyn asked. The truth, Lucy said, as if this were obvious. And it probably was, coming from a child who had spent most of her life around people who didn't tell it and had identified truth-telling as the distinguishing characteristic of the people she'd decided to trust. Evelyn nodded and did not ask what the truth had been, because she knew, and because some things don't need to be said to be real. The arrangement was made official on a Thursday in March, when the first real warmth of the approaching season was beginning to make itself felt in the afternoons, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the mud returning to Main Street with its customary lack of apology. Lucy moved her things from Agnes Pruitt's in one trip, which did not take long because she did not have many things. The iron horse came first, carried in her coat pocket. Her clothes followed, in a bag that Evelyn had quietly replaced with a larger one the week before. A small number of other objects that she arranged on the shelf in her room at the house on the north end of Main Street with the same careful deliberation she'd applied to finding the right place for the horse at Agnes's. She put the horse in the center. Silas, who had built 2 additional shelves in her room without announcing it was for her specifically, observed this arrangement from the doorway. Lucy turned and found him there and looked at him with the particular expression she used when she was deciding how much to let show. It's good wood, she said, about the shelves. White pine, he said. It'll hold. She looked at the shelves again. Will you show me how to do that? The joinery. The joinery's not hard, he said. The hard part is making sure the wall anchors are in a stud and not just the plaster. How do you know which is which? Knock on it, he said, but stud sounds solid, plaster sounds hollow. She knocked on the wall in 2 different places, listening carefully to the difference. Silas watched her do it. He had the expression he got when someone asked a question that revealed they were actually going to be worth teaching, a kind of careful, reluctant satisfaction, like a man who is pleased by something and is taking a moment to decide whether it's safe to show it. Solid, she said, about one spot. Yes, he said. She looked at him. Thank you. For the shelves. He nodded. Then he said, You're welcome, and meant it, and that was the whole ceremony of it, because that was the family they were building. Not the sentimental kind, not the kind where everything is said explicitly and wrapped with the appropriate warmth. The kind where things are understood and shown in the doing of them. Where a set of shelves is a declaration and a question about joinery is an acceptance and thank you is sufficient and enough. Spring came in properly in April, pushing the last of the serious cold back up into the high elevations where it belonged. The forge had been busy all winter, busier, if anything, than the year before, because the town's relationship with Silas's work had shifted in the small but real way that followed from the shift in their relationship with Silas himself. People who had been sending ranch hands on their behalf started coming in directly. The conversations that happened around the work were brief and functional, mostly because Silas was still Silas, and the habits of 11 years don't dissolve in 3 months. But they were happening. Earl Bellows stopped him on the street one morning in April, and the conversation that followed was not about business. Earl asked about the gate ironwork at the north end of the Caldwell spread, which Silas had mentioned in passing the week before, and listened to the answer with the attention of someone who was actually interested and not just performing interest. It was a 5-minute conversation about nothing much, but it was the first one they'd had. Evelyn watched these things with the particular attention she'd brought to everything since arriving in Iron Ridge, closely, without performing the watching, filing what she saw. She noticed when something was new and when something had changed, and she did not make too much of either, because making too much of small things tends to make people self-conscious about them, and self-consciousness tends to make people stop. What she did let herself feel, privately, was something close to satisfaction. Not triumph. She'd never wanted triumph. Had not stood up in Earl Bellows' store in December because she wanted to win something. She'd done it because it was right, and the rightness of it had not needed a victory attached to feel sufficient. But there was something that came with watching the town slowly revise itself, watching the particular posture of a place begin to relax around a man who had deserved better from it for a long time. She let herself feel that. It was honest. What surprised her, the thing she had not anticipated, was the moment that arrived in late April, on a Thursday evening after Lucy had gone to bed and the house was quiet and the spring wind was doing something gentler than its winter version against the windows. She and Silas were sitting at the kitchen table. He was working on something small at the table, as he sometimes did in the evenings, a habit she'd learned to read as a form of relaxation rather than inability to rest. She had her mending. The lamp between them threw a warm, close light. He set down what he was working on. She looked up. "I've been afraid," he said, "that you'd regret it." She held very still. "Regret what?" "Coming here." He looked at his hands on the table. "Me. This?" He gestured, meaning the house, the life, the whole particular arrangement of things. "I know what this is. I know what I am. And I know you could have—" He stopped. "You had options. You chose this one. And sometimes He stopped again. He was not a man who often said things before he was sure how to finish them. That he was doing it now told her something about how long he'd been carrying this, how carefully it had been packed down, the particular weight of it. "Sometimes you what?" she said quietly. "Sometimes I'm afraid you'll do the math," he said. "Eventually, and the math won't come out right." She set down her mending. She looked at him across the table. This man she'd come west for on the basis of a letter. This man with the honest face and the honest scars and 11 years of careful silence packed into the set of his shoulders. This man who had shown her, over 6 months, more actual character than she'd seen in people she'd known for decades. This stubborn, difficult, precise, genuinely good man who was sitting across from her in the lamplight, afraid that she'd done her arithmetic wrong. She reached across the table. She placed her hand against the right side of his face, against the scars, not avoiding them, specifically there, and she held it there and looked at him directly. "The only mistake you've ever made," she said, "was believing the story they told about you." He didn't move. He sat very still under her hand, the way people sit when they're receiving something they've needed for a long time and are afraid that moving will end it. "Evelyn, I did the math," she said. "I did it before I bought the ticket. I did it every week of those letters. I did it standing on the platform of the stagecoach before I stepped off in front of this entire ridiculous town." She kept her hand where it was. "It comes out right every time, Silas. It has from the beginning." He closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. When he opened them, his face had the look it got when something he'd been holding for a long time had been finally, carefully, set down somewhere safe. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I know," she said.
Neither am I. I forget to eat. I leave tools on the table. I don't talk enough, and when I do, I'm usually blunt about it. Yes, she agreed. And you stayed. And I stayed.
Outside, the spring wind moved through Iron Ridge with the first real warmth in it, the kind of warmth that means the worst is over, that the season has shifted in a direction that will hold. Main Street was quiet at this hour. The forge dark and cool, the mountains visible in the last of the light, white at the tops, bare rock below the snow line, then the dark green of the lower slopes coming back to life. Lucy's iron horse sat on its shelf in the room down the hall, holding its ground on uneven legs that nobody had gotten around to fixing. In the center of the shelf where it belonged, in the house where it had been brought to live, in the town that was slowly, imperfectly, with considerable resistance and occasional backsliding, learning to see what it had been looking at all along. The spring that followed was not a gentle one. It rained hard through May, turning the mountain creeks into something closer to arguments than waterways, and the mud returned to Main Street with a vengeance that made the previous autumn's version seem almost polite. The mountains stayed winter white well into June, which the older ranchers said meant a dry July, and they were right. And the dry July burned the lower pastures brown and made tempers short across the county.
None of this was unusual. What was unusual was that Silas Mercer moved through all of it as a different man than the one who had inhabited the same body 12 months earlier. Not transformed. He would have rejected that word, and correctly, because transformation implies a clean break between versions of a person that real life almost never provides. He was recognizably the same man. He still forgot to eat. He still left the mallet on the table at least twice a week. He still carried his silences like a working tool, something he reached for when words felt imprecise or insufficient. But the quality of his presence in Iron Ridge had changed in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention, which more people were now. He walked down Main Street without angling his better side toward traffic. He made eye contact with people who spoke to him, rather than offering the careful, downward-tilted acknowledgement he'd used for years to give people an easy way not to look at his face if they didn't want to. When Tom Hennessy stopped to talk on his morning round, Silas talked back. Not at length, not effusively, but as one man to another, with the assumption that the conversation was worth having. These were not large things. Taken individually, they were nearly invisible, but they accumulated, the way small things do, into something that the town felt without being able to name it exactly. The way you feel a change in a room's light without immediately identifying which window someone opened. Lucy noticed everything. She was 11 now, or close enough to it, and she had the particular observational acuity of a child who had spent years watching adults for information about whether she was safe. That skill had not disappeared. It had simply redirected itself, aimed now at things that interested her rather than things that threatened her. She watched Silas in the forge with the focused attention of an apprentice who has decided to be serious about her craft, which she had, and she watched Evelyn in the house and on the street with something more complicated. The attention of a person who is learning, for the first time, what it looks like when a woman occupies her own life without apology. She was learning ironwork in earnest now, not play, not observation, actual work, with actual instruction and actual consequences when the technique was wrong. Silas was precise and occasionally impatient in his instruction, which was the right approach for Lucy specifically because she had a low tolerance for being managed and a high tolerance for being challenged. He told her when something was done poorly. He told her when something was done well, with the same brevity, which meant that the praise landed with real weight when it came. She made a set of small hooks for the kitchen, functional, adequately formed, slightly uneven on the decorative curl at the top, and Evelyn hung them and used them, which was worth more to Lucy than any compliment. She also went to school, which had been a gap in her life at Agnes Pruitt's that nobody had particularly prioritized. Iron Ridge had a school that met 3 days a week in the church hall, run by a young woman named Miss Clara Voss, who had come from Ohio 2 years prior with a teaching certificate and the slightly winded look of someone who had underestimated the altitude. Miss Voss was good at her job in the way that people are good at jobs they chose because they actually wanted them. Not perfectly, not without frustration, but with genuine attention to whether the children in the room were actually learning anything or just sitting in a room together. She told Evelyn at the end of Lucy's second month that the girl was the fastest reader she'd seen in 3 years of teaching here. She reads like she's trying to get somewhere, Miss Voss said, which Evelyn thought was one of the more accurate descriptions of Lucy she'd heard from anyone. The forge's reputation continued to expand through the summer and into the following autumn. This was partly because Silas's work had always been worth the distance people traveled for it, and partly because the town's shift in attitude had removed the social cost of being seen to associate with him, which it turned out had been preventing some custom from further afield. A rancher from 30 miles south brought a commission for a custom gate mechanism in July, having heard about the Graves Ranch ironwork from someone who'd seen it, and the resulting piece was the most technically complex thing Silas had made in years and satisfied him in a way that straightforward, repetitive work didn't. He spent a week on it. He came home each evening smelling of coal and looking the way he looked after days that had asked something real of him. Not drained, but used well, the way a good tool looks at the end of a job it was made for. He hired help for the first time in his professional life that autumn. Pete, the young Caldwell ranch hand who'd been drifting to the forge's doorway since the previous winter, made the decision to leave cattle work and apprentice properly. He was 17, not particularly fast, but steady and willing to be wrong without it becoming an event, which Silas considered the more important quality. He paid him fairly, which was a thing Pete would mention years later to people who asked about him. Not the training, not the craft, but the fairness, which had apparently not been his prior experience of employment. The question of what Iron Ridge had been and what it was becoming was not a thing anyone sat down and formally addressed. Towns don't do that. They don't issue corrections or post amendments to their collective behavior. What they do is gradually produce different behavior until the old kind is far enough in the past that people can look back at it with a discomfort they've retrospectively decided they always felt. Some people managed this revision more honestly than others. Martha Bellows was one of the honest ones. She came by the house one afternoon in the 2nd October, Evelyn's 2nd October in Iron Ridge, which somehow felt like a more significant marker than the first, and had the kind of conversation that Martha had probably needed to have for a year and had been working up to in her slow, thorough way. She said that she'd been wrong, not about any specific thing, but in the broader sense, about Silas, about what she'd assumed, about the comfort she'd taken in the town's consensus view, without examining whether the consensus view was actually right. "I'm not asking you to say it's all right," Martha said. "I know it wasn't all right." Evelyn sat across from her and considered the woman, her neighbor, her complicated, imperfect, genuinely trying neighbor, and said, "I think what matters is what you do going forward, not the acknowledgement." Martha looked at her hands. "People like me made his life smaller than it needed to be." "Yes," Evelyn said, because that was true and there was no honest way around it. "I don't know if that's forgivable." "That's not really my question to answer," Evelyn said. "Ask Silas." Martha did not, as far as Evelyn knew, ask Silas directly, but she started greeting him on the street by name in a way she hadn't before, and she recommended his forge to her husband's business contacts from out of county, and she brought a piece of apple cake to the house at Christmas without announcement or elaboration. Small things, but the direction of them was unmistakable. It was Lucy who eventually asked the question that the adults in her life had been navigating around for a year. She asked it in November on an evening when Silas was at the kitchen table going over accounts, a thing he'd started doing more formally since Pete's hire, because two people's wages required actual bookkeeping rather than the approximate system he'd managed alone. And Evelyn was at her sewing and Lucy was ostensibly doing her reading for Miss Voss, but had clearly stopped reading 10 minutes ago and was looking at Silas with the particular focused expression she used when she was working toward something. "Why didn't you leave?" she asked. "When they were all like that to you? Why didn't you go somewhere else?" Silas looked up from the ledger. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable. "Where would I go?" he said. "Anywhere. Somewhere people didn't know your face." "People would still know my face," he said. "I'd still be carrying it." Lucy looked at him. "You know what I mean?" "I do," he said. "The honest answer is, I thought about it. More than once. In the first few years especially." He set down his pencil. "But the forge was mine. The land was mine. I'd paid for them with work, real work, and I wasn't going to let other people's opinions cost me what I'd built." He paused. "And also, I was probably too stubborn to admit they'd won." Lucy considered this. That's two different reasons.
Most decisions have more than one reason, he said. Anyone who tells you they did something for one pure reason is usually leaving something out.
Lucy looked at this from several angles, the way she looked at ironwork problems, checking for where the weakness might be. Was it worth it? She asked.
Staying. Silas looked across the table at Evelyn, who was watching the two of them over her sewing with an expression that was carefully neutral because she was curious what he'd say and didn't want to influence it.
Yes, he said. It was worth it.
He picked up his pencil again. Not because it got easier, but because the things I built here are real. The forge is real. This house is real. He didn't look up from the ledger, but he said it in a way that included more than the physical objects. You leave, you start over, and maybe the next place is better. And maybe it's the same, and you'll never know what would have happened if you'd stayed. Lucy sat with that for a minute. Then she picked her book back up, which was her way of indicating that she'd gotten what she needed from a conversation and was ready to move on. She read for another 10 minutes, and then she said without looking up, "I think you were right to stay." Neither Silas nor Evelyn said anything to that, but the quality of the silence in the room shifted in the way it did when something true had been said, and everyone present knew it. Winter came again, the second one, and it was harder than the first in the physical sense. More snow, colder sustained temperatures, a January storm that kept everyone inside for 3 days and tested the wood supply of half the households in Iron Ridge. But it was easier in every other sense, the way second winters in a place always are when you know what's coming and have prepared for it and have people to be inside with. They were snowed in for 2 of those 3 days, which meant Silas was home in the house rather than in the forge, which was a new experience for all 3 of them. He was not good at being home in the house. He kept finding things to fix that could have waited, and he rearranged the wood storage twice to a more logical configuration, and on the second day he and Lucy spent 4 hours at the kitchen table making a set of small metal implements for her school kit. A ruler with measurements he stamped into the iron, a paperweight in the shape of a bear that was better than the horse had been, but still had the slightly compressed look of something made by hands that were learning. Evelyn watched them and did her own work and felt something she'd been feeling more often as the months accumulated. Not contentment, exactly, because contentment suggests a kind of settling, and she had never been a settling person. Something more active than that. Something closer to the feeling of having placed a difficult bet with clear eyes and watched it come right. Not because luck had intervened, but because the judgment behind it had been sound. She was not naive about what remained. The town was better, not fixed. There were still people in Iron Ridge who crossed the street, who were stiff and brief in their dealings with Silas, who had privately decided that the new consensus was as wrong as the old one and were simply too outnumbered to say so. Human nature does not achieve unanimity, even when it's moving in the right direction. She'd made her peace with that more or less because the alternative, expecting complete transformation, was a way of setting yourself up for a bitterness that would cost more than it was worth. What she had not made her peace with entirely was the specific weight Silas still sometimes carried. It was lighter than it had been. The conversation in April, his hand still under hers against the side of his face, had done something real and lasting. But 11 years of a particular kind of pain doesn't dissolve in one honest conversation, or in 1 year of slow improvements, or even in 2. She saw it sometimes, in the way he held himself when someone new came into the forge and did the thing new people still occasionally did. The involuntary shift of the eyes to the right side of his face, the fraction of a second of adjustment. He'd gotten so good at not showing that he felt it that she suspected most people didn't see it at all. She saw it. She didn't always say anything. Sometimes the right response to a wound that is healing is to simply let it heal, not to keep examining it. But sometimes she said something small and specific, and he received it in the way he received all the things she said that were aimed at the truth, without deflecting, without diminishing, with the particular quiet attention of a man who has learned, slowly and at some cost, that being known by one person is not the same as being exposed to everyone, and that the difference matters enormously. It was the following spring, the 3rd spring, Lucy's first full spring as theirs, when the thing happened that Evelyn thought of later as the real end of the old story. A family came through Iron Ridge in April, heading further west, passing through the way families pass through, with too much on the wagon and not quite enough for wherever they were going, and children who had the slightly stunned look of people who have been traveling longer than they'd planned. Their wagon had thrown a wheel rim, which was why they stopped, and Silas fixed it in 2 hours, which was the work. The father paid him, and they talked for a few minutes about the road west. The mother had taken the children out to stretch their legs, and the youngest, a boy of maybe 4, wandered to the forge entrance and stood looking in at the fire the way 4-year-olds look at things that are large and bright and slightly frightening, with complete unguarded fascination. Silas came to the entrance and crouched down to the boy's eye level, which was something he did with Lucy's visiting school friends now and then, having discovered that crouching was a way of not being intimidating that also didn't require him to pretend he wasn't large. The boy looked at his face, both sides of it, with the frank curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to look away from things that are different. "Does it hurt?" the boy asked, about the scars. "Not anymore," Silas said. "It did when it happened. Not now." "How did it happen?" "Fire," Silas said. "I went into a burning house to get some people out." The boy looked at the scars with the recalibrated interest of someone incorporating new information. "Did the people get out?" "They did." The boy nodded slowly, with the gravity of a 4-year-old delivering a verdict. "That was good," he said. "Yes," Silas said. "It was." The family moved on within the hour. Silas went back to work. Lucy, who had watched the whole exchange from her position at the workbench where she'd been cleaning a file set, went back to what she was doing without comment. But later, walking home in the April evening with the mountains going pink and gold above the tree line, she said to Silas, "You smiled when that kid said it was good." Silas walked beside her and didn't say anything for a moment. "I know. You don't usually smile about it." "No," he said. "Why today?" He thought about it honestly, the way he always did when Lucy asked him something direct. Not dismissing the question, not softening the answer, just taking the actual time to find the actual response. "Because he asked the right question," he said finally. "Most people, when they see the face, they're thinking about what happened to me." He asked about the people who got out. He paused. "That's the part that matters. I forget that sometimes." Lucy walked beside him and turned this over in the way she turned things over, thoroughly and without hurry. Then she said, "I don't forget it." He looked at her. "I knew about the fire before you told me," she said. "Tom Hennessy told someone, and I overheard it at the livery. That's part of why I kept coming to the forge." She looked ahead at the street. "I wanted to see what someone looked like who did that." Silas was quiet for a long moment. They walked the rest of the way home in the good kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. Evelyn had supper on. She'd started doing a thing over the past year where she could tell by the way they came through the door what kind of day it had been. Not by what anyone said, but by the weight of the entrance, the particular quality of the silence or the noise they brought in with them. Tonight she looked up when the door opened, and she knew from the way they both came in, quieter than usual, but not the compressed quiet, the released kind, that something had happened that was good and that neither of them was quite ready to talk about yet. She put food on the table. They sat down. Lucy set the iron horse on the table, which she did occasionally when she'd carried it in her pocket, just setting it there between the plates like a presence that belonged at the table, and nobody made anything of it because by now nobody needed to. They ate. They talked about ordinary things. Miss Voss had assigned a composition about a historical subject, and Lucy had decided to write about bridge engineering, which was either very Lucy or very Silas's influence, or both. Pete had bent a piece of bar stock badly that morning and recovered it adequately, which Silas reported with the measured satisfaction of a teacher observing a student failing well. Evelyn had gotten a letter from a woman in St. Louis she'd kept in touch with, and the letter had been good news about a situation that had been worrying for months. The lamp burned, the food got eaten. The mountains outside went dark behind the windows, and the forge sat cold and quiet at the north end of Main Street. And the town around them was not perfect, and had never been perfect, and was not going to become perfect, but it was different than it had been, and the difference was real, and had been paid for with real things, with honesty that cost something, with patience that had occasionally felt indistinguishable from stubbornness, with a woman who had gotten on a stagecoach and crossed the country on the basis of a letter from a man who'd told the truth when he didn't have to, and had been right to trust it. The iron horse sat in the middle of the table on its slightly uneven legs, the left rear leg a hair longer than the others, the tail curved with the suggestion of movement. It was not a perfect thing. It had never been a perfect thing. It had been made by two people at different skill levels, one teaching and one learning, in a cold forge in November when everything was still uncertain and most of it was still hard, and it had survived and it was still standing, and that was the whole of what any made thing can honestly promise. After supper, after Lucy had gone to her room with her book and her composition notes, Silas and Evelyn sat at the table in the quiet that was theirs, genuinely theirs now, built from 2 years of learning each other's silences and finding that most of them were livable, some of them were good, and a few of them were the best parts of any given day. She reached across the table and picked up the iron horse, turned it in her hands the way she had in the forge that first November, looking at it properly. "She's going to be better than you someday," she said, "at the ironwork." Silas looked at the horse in her hands. "Probably," he said, without any particular reluctance about it. She already asked better questions. Evelyn set the horse down. She looked at her husband across the table. This man with his honest, scarred, entirely real face, who had put an advertisement in 3 newspapers and told the truth about himself when a lie would have been so much easier, and who had been afraid every day since she'd arrived that the math wouldn't come out right. The math came out right. She had known it would. She had known it on the platform of the stagecoach before she'd even seen his face, because she had read who he was in the shape of his sentences, in the way he'd said what he meant and meant what he said, and refused to make himself easier to accept than he actually was. That is the thing people get wrong about courage. They think it lives in the dramatic moments, in burning houses, in public confrontations, in stagecoaches heading west toward uncertain things, and it does live there. But it also lives in the ordinary places, in an honest advertisement, in a letter that says, "I don't know how to be what you need, but I want to try." In a man who sits at a kitchen table after a long day and admits he is afraid. In a woman who crosses a room and puts her hand on the hardest part of someone's face and says, "The only mistake you ever made was believing the story they told about you." Iron Ridge did not become a different place overnight. It became a different place slowly, the way all real change happens, through the accumulation of small decisions made by ordinary people who chose, in specific moments, to be slightly better than their habits. And the blacksmith on the north end of Main Street, with his forge and his wife and his girl and his apprentice and his iron horse and his 2 years of something that felt, improbably and genuinely and without any remaining qualification, like home. He kept working. He kept telling the truth. He kept showing up to his own life with the particular unglamorous courage of a person who has decided that being known is worth the risk of being seen. The mountains held their positions above the town, indifferent and permanent. The seasons came in their order. The work continued. And that, in the end, was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was everything.